After the decisive Japanese defeat at Midway, one of the turning points of the Pacific War, the initiative had shifted into the hands of the Allies. But while the Americans prepared their first offensive operation against Guadalcanal, the invaders were also continuing their own offensive designs on the island of New Guinea. Their objective, Port Moresby, the most important Allied base in the Papua region. And yet, Generals MacArthur and Blamey were not ready to relinquish such a valuable place. Consequently, unit after unit of the Australian Army was committed to fight one of the most elite forces of the Japanese Empire, and if possible, to counterattack and clear the enemy from the Papua region. This is the tale of those brave Australian soldiers who, despite being overwhelmed, outnumbered and undersupplied, managed to hold off the Japanese behemoth on the bloody Kokoda Track. This is the tale of those tenacious Japanese troops who, despite the lack of food, water, reinforcements and equipment, still pressed on and almost managed the impossible. Thus join us as we cover the Papua Campaign in its full depth, from the start of the Kokoda Track offensive to the final reduction of the Japanese positions on Buna-Gona and Sanananda. These long videos are very difficult to make, so we hope that you'll give us your comment, like and share, and will consider joining our Patreon or YouTube membership. Links in the description. This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels, and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Back in late April and early May, the Japanese were rejoicing after their great string of victories across the Pacific. They had subdued their enemy in Southeast Asia and had put a great threat on both Ceylon and Hawaii. Such was their triumph that they found that all of their initial objectives for the war had already been achieved, and now they needed to start planning the next steps of their liberation of the Orient. As we will recall, both the IJA and the IJN commanders had different objectives in mind, but even inside the IJN, there was a huge argument between Nagano's and Yamamoto's followers. The compromise they reached resulted in the decision to carry out the invasions of Port Moresby and Midway, which, as we have recently seen, turned out to be a disaster for the Empire. But this compromise also included a planned invasion of Fiji, New Caledonia and Samoa, codenamed Operation FS, which was going to take place after the successful destruction of the Pacific Fleet at Midway. This operation aimed to completely neutralize Australia by cutting it off from the United States, since the Japanese had already achieved supremacy over the Indian Ocean after the April raid there. Thus, on May 18th, the 17th Army was established to carry out Operation FS under the command of Lieutenant General Hyakutake Harukichi. The coming defeat at Midway, however, would soon show that plans were definitely going to need a change. On July 11th, while the troops were steadily making preparations for combat, the operation was finally cancelled, and Hyakutake was given a new objective: to capture Port Moresby and any other strategic points in the eastern part of New Guinea Island. With the loss of 4 Japanese fleet carriers, an amphibious assault was no longer an option, so instead Hyakutake's forces were to land on the east coast of New Guinea and execute an overland drive across the towering Owen Stanley Range towards Port Moresby. Meanwhile, during this period, General MacArthur continued to organize his unified command over the Southwest Pacific. He had much work to do, as the air, naval and land forces there were inadequate, both in number and in training. In the same conditions he had already fought and lost the Philippines campaign. Thankfully, the governments of Australia and New Zealand tended to be in agreement so that they could grant complete cooperation to the American general. This allowed MacArthur to develop the defences of Australia, to reorganise the Australian army, and to integrate their forces arriving from the Mediterranean front with the American units. In that regard, by June, MacArthur could count with 10 Australian and 2 American divisions for his Allied land forces, totaling around 400,000 men, under the overall leadership of Australian General Sir Thomas Blamey. The defence of Australia was divided into 4 major commands, with the 1st Australian Army of Lieutenant General Sir John Laverack holding Eastern Australia, the 2nd Australian Army of Lieutenant General Sir Ivan Mackay at Southern Australia, the Northern Territory Force of Major General Edmund Herring, located mainly around Darwin, and the Australian 3rd Corps defending Western Australia, led by General Bennett, who had managed to escape Singapore before its fall. Furthermore, the New Guinea Force was formed in April under the command of Major General Basil Morris, tasked with the defence of the territories of Papua and New Guinea. It consisted of the Papuan Infantry Battalion and the 14th and 30th Australian Brigades at Port Moresby, as well as the remnants of the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles, which continued to monitor the Japanese presence in the Huon Gulf region. Upon assuming his command, MacArthur had determined that a passive defence was strategically unsound, instead planning to move forward more than 1,000 miles into eastern Papua and to construct airfields to disrupt any Japanese attempt at invading Port Moresby. He was limited by the meagre resources at his disposal, but he was determined to make the best of them while developing the rest of the Australian and American forces for the future. In April, the remnants of the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles were also reinforced with a platoon of Australian commandos, forming the guerrilla unit known as Kanga Force, which was tasked with harassing and interrupting the development of Japanese bases at Lae and Salamaua. 1 month later, MacArthur and Blamey had decided to employ the Kanga Force to execute a limited offensive from the gold mines of Wau. As May progressed, Major Norman Flay's Kanga Force continued to make preparations for a series of raids over Lae and Salamaua, but he was at the same time threatened by the possible Japanese advance on the Bulalo Valley, so he was forced to defend the valuable air installations at Wau and to postpone the raids for a later date. After June 7th, however, the victory at Midway would show that the situation had changed, and that it was now favourable to finally take the offensive. Yet there was still the matter of what would be the objective of the operation, a target that should justify the employment of the limited resources available. To the north, the Japanese presence in the Aleutians was worrying, but the danger was remote, and the possibility of strategic gain was very small. In the Central Pacific, the IJN was still seen as an enemy too strong to defeat, and the danger to Hawaii was tiny due to the recent triumph at Midway. To the south, at last, the danger against New Guinea and Australia was imminent, something that would end up determining the choice of the Allied objective. While MacArthur and Blamey planned the defence of New Guinea and a possible counterattack to recapture Lae and Salamaua, Admirals Nimitz and King were also planning to conduct their own offensive against the southern Solomon Islands, intended to open a path for an eventual drive against Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the South Pacific. From the start of the war, the British believed that King staunchly opposed the strategy of Europe first, but the American admiral actually strongly believed in it. It was his aggressive style that made him uneasy about leaving any resources idle in the Atlantic if they could be used in the Pacific. In that regard, he argued that some sort of offensive against Japan should be conducted to prevent the enemy from becoming so firmly entrenched that it would be extremely difficult to dislodge them. To appease the army planners, he had successfully established a series of strongpoints in the South Pacific, from where he intended to launch the drive northwards into the Solomons, using only marine forces for it. Yet concurrently, General MacArthur also had his own plans for an offensive in the region. On June 8th, he presented his plans for a full-scale assault against New Britain and New Ireland, intended to gain control of Rabaul and the strategic Bismarck archipelago in just 14 days. For this, he requested a division trained for amphibious operations, possibly the 1st Marine Division, and 3 carriers to support the offensive. This bold plan, codenamed Tulsa, had the support of the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, and was very well received in Washington. Everyone there agreed on the desirability of the operation and the need for speed, but a conflict soon erupted with Admiral King, who wanted the operation to be commanded by the Navy, as it was primarily of a naval and amphibious character. MacArthur disagreed with this and wanted the army to lead the offensive. After all, the objective of the operation did fall into his area of command. Thus, with the issue of command soon becoming a contest between Army and Navy, MacArthur was denied the Marine Division and the aircraft carriers that he had requested. Another reason this plan was opposed is because King, with the support of Rear Admiral Charles Cook, chief of the Navy War Plans Division, pointed out that the enemy air bases in the region were too strong and could therefore place the carriers in grave danger. For them, it would be safer to go slowly up the Solomons to Rabaul, eliminating the enemy air bases as they went along. MacArthur had to agree on this matter, recognizing the necessity of gaining positions on the Solomons and on the north coast of New Guinea as the preliminary steps for an invasion of New Britain. But on the subject of command, he would definitely not yield. His first draft of Operation Tulsa, though, would be rapidly discarded nonetheless, as it needed revision for the excessively rapid timing of the operation. In the meantime, MacArthur was also planning to construct an important airbase over Milne Bay. This base could secure Port Moresby's eastern flank, and could also pave the way for an attack on Buna while avoiding any movement over the harsh Owen Stanley Mountains. On June 12th, he finally authorized the construction of a secret base at Gili Gili over the head of Milne Bay. 10 days later, a company of the 46th American Engineer Battalion and 2 companies and a machine gun platoon of the 55th Australian Battalion were secretly and skillfully transported along the coast to the site of the projected base in what was known as Operation Fall River. The operation was very successful and was unhampered by the enemy, as if the Japanese had discovered them, they would have made every effort to prevent the construction of this base. In addition to this, MacArthur also ordered the construction of another airbase at Maroubra, located on the southern coast of Dutch New Guinea, intending to protect Port Moresby's western flank. Furthermore, by late June, the time was finally ripe for Kanga Force to launch its first raid on Japanese land. Reinforced with the 2nd 5th Independent Company of Major Thomas Keane, Major Flay finally had sufficient men to both maintain a large force in the Bulalo Valley and at the same time conduct a number of raids. Among his objectives were Heath's plantation on the way to Lae, the Japanese major airbase in Salamaua, and Lae's own air installations. He finally decided to launch 2 raids, one over Heath's plantation and another over Salamaua. During the early hours of June 29th, a collection of some 70 raiders, led by Captain Norman Winning, including Australian commandos and NGVR veterans, conducted a very successful raid over Salamaua, dividing his forces into 7 parties and executing an impressive scouting operation to know the weak spots of the invaders. Winning inflicted several casualties on the Japanese, captured many vital documents, and blew up a bridge, some houses at Keller Point, and the native hospital without losing a single man. Additionally, the mortar party got to fire a total of 36 bombs over Salamaua, scoring a critical hit at a strongpost on the neck of the isthmus. By midday, all Australian forces had managed to withdraw without pursuit from the enemy, successfully concluding their first raid. The success of this attack also left the Japanese feeling very nervous about the security of their main base, so they decided to reinforce Salamaua with a further 200 soldiers, thus limiting the resources of the invaders. 2 days later, another company of around 70 men, under the command of Major Neen, launched a raid over Heath's plantation. Under an incessant rain, the raiders stealthily killed the sentries on the plantation and then commenced the assault on Heath, while also blowing up a bridge in front of the farm to cause chaos among the Japanese. In the ensuing firefight, much damage had been inflicted to the house, and around 40 Japanese were supposedly killed. But the action was called off after Major Neen was shot in the chest and soon died of his wounds. Leaderless, the Australians would successfully escape to the west, but the success of this raid was not as big as that of winning. Nonetheless, an unexpected blow had been struck at the invaders, resulting in a general increase to Allied morale. Yet a retaliation was expected, so Flay and the guerrilla Kanga force had to go into hiding. Meanwhile, discussions for the future offensive were still raging on. With no compromise reached, on June 25th, Admiral King submitted his own draft for the invasion of the Solomons, to be carried out exclusively by Marines and Navy units, and with some support from MacArthur's aircraft, ships and submarines. Such was his resolution that he went ahead and ordered Nimitz to commence preparations for the forthcoming operation. Marshall didn't oppose this plan, but he kept MacArthur's claim to command of the offensive. Yet King responded to him that he didn't need MacArthur or his forces for the operation, bluntly warning that he was ready to open the offensive at any time. When MacArthur discovered this, he rapidly refused to grant any support for the invasion of the Solomons, and he outright accused the Navy of hoping to gain complete control over national defense and reduce the army to a training and supply organization. In response, Marshall quickly appeased him by reminding him of his duty to fight the Japanese in the war, and then set up to work on a compromise between Army and Navy. On June 30th, he personally met with Admiral King to discuss the matter, and finally struck a compromise on the troublesome question of command. Thus, on July 2nd, a directive was issued by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the New Britain New Ireland New Guinea offensive to be conducted in 3 phases. Under the command of Vice Admiral Robert Gormley and his South Pacific area, called for an assault on Tulagi and the various Solomons, which would be the stepping stone for the whole operation. The second phase was the seizure of Lae, Salamaua, the northeastern coast of New Guinea, and the remainder of the Solomon Islands, which would be conducted by MacArthur and his Southwest Pacific area, although exactly when this shift of command would happen was reserved for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the third phase, which was the final attack on Rabaul and its adjacent positions, would also be under MacArthur's command. This diplomatic victory by Marshall would lay the foundations for the future operations against the Japanese, which would see some of the most bitter fighting of the entire Pacific War. As we have previously seen, in mid-May, the Japanese Empire had established the 17th Army under the command of General Hyakutake, tasked with the execution of Operation FS, which involved the capture of the islands of New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa to cut off the line of supply between Australia and the US. Although the 17th Army was rather small, Hyakutake could count with the full support of Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet, including the 4th Fleet of Admiral Inoue, the Kido Butai of Admiral Nagumo, and the 2nd Fleet of Admiral Kondo. Originally, it was intended that right after the capture of Port Moresby and Midway, the South Seas Detachment would launch the invasion of New Caledonia, followed by the invasions of Fiji and Samoa, to be carried out by the Kawaguchi Detachment and the Higashi Detachment respectively. Yet after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese also had to draw plans for a second sea route invasion of Port Moresby under the Alba Detachment to be launched concurrently with General Horii's invasion of New Caledonia. In early June, however, the disaster at Midway would promptly bring a sudden end to Hyakutake's plans. Across the month of June, his troops continued to prepare for the operation, even though it had been postponed. But on July 11th, the Japanese commanders decided to finally cancel Operation FS, to the surprise of Hyakutake's staff, appointing the 17th Army to instead prepare for a difficult overland drive across the Owen Stanley Range towards Port Moresby, since an amphibious invasion was no longer an option after the huge losses suffered at Midway. In that regard, Admiral Yamamoto and the other IJN leading commanders had determined that the defeat at Midway made future operations in the Pacific untenable, but that some military operations in the South Pacific, with the aid of the IJA, would still be feasible. This is because they estimated that the US would make counterattacks in 1943 at the earliest, giving them time to recuperate a little bit from Midway with the rebuilding of their carrier force. In the meantime, many admirals and generals believed that they should now aim their offensives westwards towards the weakened British Empire, which at the time was suffering many setbacks in the North African campaign. Both the Italians and the Germans requested that the Japanese Empire should coordinate with them to stop American and British reinforcements moving towards Egypt through the Indian Ocean, to increase the blockade of East Africa, and to assist in the invasion of the Soviet Union with the capture of Vladivostok. Yet Japan didn't want any trouble with the Soviet Union, with which it had a non-aggression pact signed after their troops were soundly beaten at Khalkhin Gol, and also after their defeat at Midway, they didn't have enough naval resources to conduct such a blockade of the Indian Ocean. Moreover, the Japanese were still focused on the destruction of marine transports between Australia and the US, so they would only send a total of 2 submarines towards the Indian Ocean to disrupt the enemy's logistics in the following months. This essentially tossed aside any possible collaboration with the Axis, and thus left the Japanese to fend for themselves in the Pacific. Yet after the Battle of Midway, the great losses suffered in terms of aircraft carriers, planes, and highly trained carrier staff forced Admiral Yamamoto to also reorganize the combined fleet on July 14th, re-establishing the 3rd Fleet as an aircraft carrier task force, modeled after similar units in the United States. Led by Admiral Nagumo, it was based around the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, supported by the light carriers Ryujo and Suiho, with the addition of the recently constructed Hio-class carriers Junyo and Hio. It was also reinforced with 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 7 destroyers, and it borrowed 5 heavy cruisers and 8 destroyers from the 2nd Fleet, leaving Admiral Kondo's formation as a small vanguard force. Furthermore, the 4th Fleet of Admiral Inoue, which defended the recently conquered territories in the New Guinea region, was reduced to guarding the inner core territories of the Central Pacific at the Caroline, Marshall, Mariana and Palau Islands. In its place, the 8th Fleet was formed, under the command of Vice Admiral Mikawa Guniichi, tasked with the defense of the South Pacific. It consisted of a strong fleet, formed around 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, a submarine squadron, and a variety of destroyers. By the end of July, Mikawa would lead his newly established fleet towards Truk, and from there to Rabaul, where he established his headquarters. Hyakutake and his staff were still conducting their research for the feasibility of an overland attack on Port Moresby, being particularly interested on whether or not the Kokoda Track could be traversed. As the Owen Stanley Range was narrowest to the southwest of Kokoda, if the range could be traversed, then Port Moresby would be ready for the taking. Luckily for them, Japanese research into local accounts and testimonies would be very successful, discovering the existence of 3 roads from the coast to Kokoda. From these 3, the road from Buna to Kokoda appeared as the best one, since Japanese aerial reconnaissance had identified that it could accommodate motor vehicles, which essentially rendered an overland offensive as entirely possible. In that regard, the 17th Army was planning to occupy the area along the banks of the Mambare River in cooperation with Navy units, from where a bridgehead reconnaissance force would be sent to determine if this route was acceptable for the attack on Port Moresby, and to lay the initial groundwork for such an operation. For this task, General Horii and his South Seas Detachment were again selected to conduct the Port Moresby offensive, since the Alba Detachment was still assembling far away at Davao. This was a difficult choice for Hyakutake, as Horii was unenthusiastic about the overland offensive, stating that it would be extremely difficult and with a high risk of failure. Yet the transfer of the Alba detachment from Davao to Rabaul was considered extremely difficult due to possible enemy air attacks, so the South Seas Detachment would have to do. This operation was also something that General MacArthur was expecting, as he believed that the Japanese intended to employ the Kokoda Track either to directly assault Port Moresby or to establish a supply base for a possible amphibious invasion of the Louisiade Archipelago. To forestall such a move, on June 21st he had decided with General Blamey to form the Maroubra Force, consisting of the Papuan Infantry Battalion and the 39th Australian Battalion, to defend the Kokoda Track from any incoming enemy attacks and to prevent the Japanese from penetrating the Owen Stanley Range. Some 280 native troops of the Papuan Battalion were already north of the range, and they were directed by MacArthur to move forward overland and occupy a number of key points between Kokoda and Buna, while the 39th would strengthen the southern terminus of the Kokoda Track. As part of Operation Providence, upon getting to Buna, the Papuan troops would also receive personnel, material and supplies for the construction of an aerodrome in the area. During this overland advance, the Allied commanders would recognize that their information on the geography and topography of the region was inadequate, so they would also order the start of a research operation. In that regard, the Allied Geographical Section was established on July 19th to assemble and evaluate all geographic information in the region, and the Allied Intelligence Bureau was also formed in July, tasked with collecting intelligence through clandestine operations behind enemy lines, to secure cooperation and aid from the natives, and also to conduct sabotage operations over the enemy. Both of these agencies would play a very important role in the future. But looking back to the Japanese, after receiving a great order from Colonel Tsuji on July 11th, the research operation was suddenly finalized, even though enough information had not been acquired yet, and the South Seas Detachment was rapidly mobilized to carry out Operation RI, the invasion of the Buna-Gona area, in preparation for the overland drive against Port Moresby. For this, the Yokoyama advance party would depart Rabaul on the night of July 20th, escorted by a small fleet under Rear Admiral Matsuyama Mitsuharu. The convoy proceeded southwest along the sea lane to the south of New Britain, only being harassed without any real damage by some B-17 and B-26 bombers during the run across to New Guinea. Led by Colonel Yokoyama Yosuke of the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment, the advance party landed at Gona during the afternoon of July 21st, while a company of SNLF Marines debarked at Buna roughly at the same time. With the 25th Air Flotilla's planes giving them support from the air, the landings proceeded as expected and without encountering any resistance, so Buna would be secure in Japanese hands by July 22nd. There, the IJN units began the immediate construction of an enlarged airfield after securing the beachhead, while the vanguard of the Yokoyama advance party began in earnest to move towards Kokoda. To support this operation, the invaders also launched a series of air raids over Port Moresby and sent some soldiers from Lae and Salamaua to attack the Australian strongpoints at Gabamatsang and Mubo, intended as a feint to cover the Buna landings and to stop the increasing guerrilla activities in these areas. At Gabamatsang, the Japanese attack was very successful, resulting in the complete withdrawal south of the Mahakam River of the Australian forces. But at Mubo, the invaders were faced with some 64 Australian commandos, which inflicted many casualties on the Japanese before also retreating southwards. Meanwhile at Buna, the IJN units suffered a heavy air attack on July 22nd, as the Americans sent over 100 bombers to disrupt the Japanese landings. Reinforcements of the South Seas Detachment began to arrive in the following days, even despite the intensification of the Allied air attacks, although this made the journey much more perilous. Although it was a good start for the operation, Colonel Yokoyama would now have to fulfill the true objective of the offensive with a difficult advance on the Kokoda Track. During the invasion, patrols from the Papuan Battalion had observed the Japanese landings from a distance, reporting the events back to camp and to General Morris's headquarters at Port Moresby. In response, Morris quickly decided to concentrate the 39th Battalion at Kokoda, placing Lieutenant Colonel William Owen in charge of the Maroubra Force and tasking him with preventing any Japanese penetration southwest of Kokoda. If Owen failed to stop the advance of the invaders, then he was to retire to previously prepared positions on the southern terminus of the Kokoda Track. Meanwhile, Captain Sam Templeton of B Company took command of the Allied units north of Kokoda and established some defensive positions on Awala and Gorari. By the afternoon of July 23rd, Colonel Yokoyama's advance was in full swing, with his vanguard, led by Lieutenant Colonel Sugimoto Hatsuo, reaching Awala and quickly defeating a detachment of Papuan soldiers, thus forcing them to retreat into the jungle. The rest of the Allied forces would also have to withdraw from Awala to Wairopi with orders to only execute contact and rearguard actions while closing back on Kokoda. The next day, the situation appeared more stable, as Tsukamoto's men looked like they had spent the night at Awala, but in reality they were close behind the Papuan lookouts. Advancing with speed, the invaders fell on the unsuspecting Allied soldiers and forced them to retreat back to Gorari, where Colonel Owen had finally arrived to take command of the Maroubra Force. Many PIB soldiers deserted using the confusion. There, Owen had decided to make a stand 800 yards east of Gorari, dispersing his Australian soldiers beside the track, with some of the Papuans in the thick bush on their flanks. By midday on July 24th, the Japanese troops finally walked out of the bush track into the ambush laid by the Australians, suffering many casualties against the defenders before the Allied forces had to withdraw back to Gorari. Yet the invaders were swift and determined in their pursuit, and after a couple of hours, they had managed to engage the enemy again, successfully routing them and making them flee in despair towards Oivi. The Australians were exhausted and had also suffered many losses at this point, so Owen knew that he desperately needed some reinforcements if he hoped to hold Kokoda against the attacks of the enemy. In that regard, he asked General Morris for the aerial transportation of 2 companies towards Kokoda, but the Australians only counted with 2 aircraft at Port Moresby, so Morris was only able to fly some 30 men to reinforce the defenders by July 26th. These 30 men were immediately sent forward to Oivi, where they arrived in the afternoon, just before the start of the Japanese attack. Initially, the attackers were halted just outside of Oivi by the strength of the Australian fire, but the defenders would eventually be outflanked and would have to retreat towards their main positions on the plateau on which Oivi stood, comprising a 50-yard perimeter. During the next hours, the combatants only exchanged some desultory fire between them, with the Australians successfully managing to keep the Japanese outside of the perimeter. Despite the apparent calmness, many losses were suffered on both sides, such as Captain Templeton, who was allegedly captured and later executed by the invaders. The tale of a Japanese soldier tells that he would then be interrogated by Colonel Tsukamoto, during which the Australian laughed at his enemy and lied, stating that there were 80,000 Australians at Port Moresby. This angered Tsukamoto, who in his rage killed Templeton with his own sword. In his honour, the first point where the Kokoda Track crosses Eora Creek would be named Templeton's Crossing. With dusk falling, the Japanese at last started to encircle the tired defenders and moved in for the kill, but they were held at bay by the strong machine gun fire of the Australians. Judging that the enemy fire was high and wild, and that the Japanese vastly outnumbered them, Major William Watson decided that a withdrawal towards Deniki was their best option, so he led his forces south during the night under the cover of heavy rain. After stumbling into creeks and struggling with the bushes while being hampered by the darkness and the rainfall, the exhausted Australian forces had only managed to traverse 2 miles from Oivi by the dawn of July 27th. Meanwhile, Colonel Yokoyama was content with the progress of his vanguard, and he was also happy to find out that the road from Buna-Gona inland to Saputa was passable by motor vehicles without repair. Although the coastal roads were in good condition, some of his units would have to move through the jungle and occasional grasslands, something that was difficult for the Japanese due to its many rivers and steep gullies. By July 26th, however, the bulk of the advance party had rejoined the Japanese vanguard at Oivi, and they were now preparing for their final advance on Kokoda after the escape of Watson's forces. Hampered by waves of aerial attacks, Yokoyama would be forced to move by night to remain undetected by the deadly Allied bombers. At the same time, Owen had lost communications with Oivi, and, being uncertain that he could defend Kokoda with the little forces he had available, he decided to burn down the town and then withdraw to Deniki. Owen and his small group of reinforcements arrived at their destination on the morning of July 28th, where, to their surprise, they found Watson and the forces that had safely retreated from Oivi. Reinforced with Watson's men, Owen gambled that he now boasted enough forces to defend Kokoda, so he decided to retrieve the situation with haste, hurrying back to Kokoda with the bulk of the Papuan Battalion and B Company. By midday, Owen had reached the administrative area on the extreme tip of the Kokoda Plateau, deploying his forces in front of the track that led to Oivi, from where the Australians felt an attack would soon come. The two Port Moresby aircraft, carrying more reinforcements, circled over Kokoda during the afternoon, but the airstrip was full of barricades, and thus the pilots felt it too risky to land, and were ordered by General Morris to return back to base. Disquieting signs of Japanese movement then followed until dusk, but to the relief of the defenders, no attack came by the end of the day. During the night, however, Colonel Tsukamoto had sent forward a vanguard of around 200 soldiers, led by Captain Ogawa Tetsuo, which approached Kokoda from the east before moving towards the flanks of the Australian position. In the early hours of July 29th, the Japanese began to lay down machine gun and mortar fire upon the defenders, who had nothing to counter the mortars with, launching an emphatic attack up the steep slope of the northern end of the area. Amidst a misty moonlight, the battle saw close fighting as the Japanese charged and the Australians attempted to beat them back with grenades. While leading the men during the struggle, Owen himself was throwing down grenades when a bullet hit him above the right eye and left him very injured. Once again, Major Watson assumed command of the Australian forces, but he couldn't prevent his men from becoming separated by the heavy pressure of the invaders. The relentless Japanese soldiers soon began to infiltrate the northern positions of the defenders, as well as their flanks, slowly pushing back the Australians and forcing them to leave their injured behind, including Colonel Owen, who would later die of his wounds. Luckily for Major Watson, the same mist that had aided the Japanese in their attempts to infiltrate the Australian positions was now helping the defenders to retreat back towards Deniki. Although they had lost only a handful of men and had inflicted over 40 casualties on the enemy, including Captain Ogawa, who was killed in the final stages of the fighting, the loss of Kokoda now facilitated the Japanese overland offensive against Port Moresby. With his advance on Kokoda, Colonel Yokoyama had also been able to repair many roads and build many bridges, making motor transportation possible for 60 kilometers from the coast to Sonbo. Yet the roads west of Sonbo proved to be only suitable for pack horses, so the town of Sonbo would be stockpiled with ammunition and supplies. On Kokoda, the Japanese would also capture a large amount of grenades, machine guns and ammunition, as the defenders only carried with them what equipment they could during the withdrawal. As for the Australians under Watson, they would have a week of respite in which they would be reinforced by 3 companies of the 39th Battalion, and could also be resupplied with ammunition. On Kokoda, Colonel Tsukamoto had concentrated the bulk of his battalion, totaling some 660 men, in preparation for an offensive to secure the line of the Owen Stanley Range. While on Deniki, the defenders were reinforced with 3 companies of the 39th Battalion, carrying some much-needed supplies, and Major Alan Cameron also arrived to replace the deceased Colonel Owen as commander of Maroubra Force. Now bolstering a force of 433 men, Cameron had decided to conduct a 3-pronged counterattack against Kokoda, preparing to depart on the morning of August 8th. At the same time, Tsukamoto left Kokoda on August 7th, advancing towards Gira and Deniki, yet both forces would soon meet each other in battle before reaching their objectives. Although the soldiers from A Company had managed to advance undetected and had successfully recaptured a very lightly defended Kokoda, C Company quickly ran into Tsukamoto's main column. As the Japanese responded with machine gun fire, the Australians fought valiantly against a superior force, yet they could only drive the invaders from their most forward positions. Eventually, Cameron decided to withdraw C Company and prepare the defences at Deniki, as Tsukamoto was in hard pursuit of his fleeing enemy and would fire against the Australian forward positions until nightfall. Meanwhile, D Company had managed to capture Pirivi after a hard-fought engagement in the thick bush, but Japanese reinforcements from Oivi soon fell upon them and eventually forced them to retreat towards Komondo. From there, the Australians would rejoin the defenders at Deniki, where Tsukamoto was continuing his assault on the morning of August 9th. Cameron would successfully manage to hold off the invaders for the remainder of the day, with the Japanese attacks waning as the afternoon advanced. This was because Tsukamoto had been alerted of the fall of Kokoda, so he decided to send a company of his main force to retake Kokoda. Dug in at the old Australian positions, A Company fought ferociously against the invaders, driving them to the ground with the strength of its fire. As dawn broke on August 10th, the Australians continued to resist the relentless Japanese attacks both on Deniki and Kokoda, but A Company needed to be resupplied by air if it hoped to survive for a while longer. By afternoon, there was no sign of any airdrops, as the expected aircraft with the supplies flew over Kokoda unable to land, so the Australians would have to withdraw to the west of Kokoda amidst a violent Japanese assault. A Company would then have to cross Madi Creek and head to the western side of Whaiwani Creek before moving to the village of Naro and then to Isurava, leaving it unable to participate in the defense of Deniki. Although Cameron's offensive to retake Kokoda had ended in defeat, he had indeed delayed the Japanese advance on Deniki and had surprised the Japanese commanders to such an extent that, coupled with the recent developments in the southern Solomons, the invaders would decide to delay their Port Moresby offensive until the rest of General Horii's South Seas detachment, with the Yazawa detachment attached, could arrive at the battlefront. Reinforced with an additional company, Cameron would continue to fight back the renewed Japanese attacks on August 13th. On the morning of August 14th, however, Tsukamoto finally managed to break through the Western Australian positions, so Cameron would have to order a hasty withdrawal towards Isurava, in which the men would leave behind most of their equipment and supplies. Already worried about the Japanese thrust through the Kokoda Track, General Blamey had been preparing the 2-division 1st Australian Corps of Lieutenant General Sidney Rabaul to land on New Guinea and take command of the defence of Port Moresby. On August 12th, while Rabaul was replacing General Norris as commander of the New Guinea force, Brigadier Selwyn Porter of the 30th Brigade was ordered to take command of the Maroubra Force, getting reinforced with troops from the 53rd Battalion. During Porter's brief command, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor would be appointed to lead the 39th Battalion and would fight a series of minor skirmishes against the Japanese at Isurava. On August 23rd, Porter would finally hand over command of the Maroubra Force to Brigadier Arnold Potts, who would immediately prepare to face and stop the Japanese advance as he awaited for his 21st Brigade to arrive at Isurava. Meanwhile, General Hyakutake continued his plans to land the South Seas detachment of General Horii and the 41st Regiment of Colonel Yazawa Kiyomi in the Buna-Gona area, and to launch an amphibious invasion of Milne Bay with the Kawaguchi detachment, aiming to support the overland drive on Port Moresby with it. Although the first echelons of Horii and Yazawa's men had successfully landed on New Guinea on August 21st, Hyakutake's plans for Milne Bay would have to change, because as we've seen, the Kawaguchi detachment was redirected to take part in Operation Ka. Instead, the control of Operation RE was handed over to Admiral Mikawa and his 8th Fleet, who appointed some 950 SNLF Marines under Commander Hayashi Masajiro, 2 Hago tanks and a further 450 Navy units to conduct the amphibious invasion. As for the Americans, they had landed the 7th Australian Brigade of Brigadier John Field back on July 11th, when MacArthur had ordered the construction of an airbase at Rabaul. By August, the airfield had almost been completed, and the Milne force was reinforced with the 18th Australian Brigade in anticipation of an expected attack. Major General Cyril Clowes took over command of the defence of Milne Bay on August 12th, and by the 28th, his forces would total some 4,500 infantry and around 4,300 construction personnel. On the morning of August 24th, amidst a preparatory air bombing of the Australian positions, the main invasion force departed Rabaul, covered by a small fleet under the command of Rear Admiral Matsuyama Mitsuharu. During the afternoon, Matsuyama's convoy was spotted by Australian coast watchers, yet the defenders could not employ their aircraft against the invaders due to bad weather. At the same time, Commander Tsukioka Torishige's 350 SNLF Marines, coming from Buna, were spotted as they quickly landed at Goodenough Island to rest, yet Australian Kitty Hawks would go on to strafe their barges and leave them stranded on the island. On August 25th, as the Japanese continued to advance unmolested, Clowes ordered some of his dispersed forces in the east to concentrate around Rabaul, although these would soon meet the enemy as they retreated. At 22:30, Hayashi's men finally landed near Wagga Wagga, rapidly establishing a beachhead and skirmishing with Australian patrols to the west, while being harassed by Kittyhawks in the landing area, something that would force the invaders to move only by night. The next morning, however, the Japanese began their advance in force, soon finding in the afternoon that an Australian company had repelled their advance party. Despite the tenacity of the defenders, heavy fire and the tanks would eventually force them to withdraw towards Motio, where they were to be reinforced by elements of the 25th and 61st Battalions. Arriving at the creek, the Australians tried to establish a defensive position, yet the Japanese followed closely behind them and harassed their rear elements. During the night, Hayashi decided to launch a savage assault, supported by surface fire from Matsuyama's vessels. Confusing fighting ensued, lit only by moonlight, but despite their resistance, the Australian forward positions were becoming untenable. During the early hours of August 27th, Hayashi also sent some Marines around the Australian positions while shouting in English orders to retreat. Some 50 defenders would be deceived by this ruse, withdrawing to Gili Gili, while the Japanese continued to outflank the rest of them. At 04:30, the weary Australians finally had to retreat towards the Gamma River, soon being relieved there by the 2nd 10th Battalion as they pulled back towards Gili Gili. Yet the newly arrived battalion continued its advance further east, where they would engage the Japanese tanks around 2000 hours. Pressed by the enemy and unable to disable the tanks, the Australians suffered heavy casualties, but managed to repel 4 subsequent assaults. By midnight, however, the Japanese had infiltrated their positions, and in the confusion, the defenders would have to retreat in disorder towards Gamma. By 0200 on August 28th, the Australians had reached the river at scattered positions, yet the Japanese followed in hot pursuit and soon penetrated their defensive line, thus forcing the remainder of the battalion to withdraw further west in desperation towards Gili Gili. With the enemy continuing its advance, Field and Clowes decided to then deploy the 25th Battalion between Rabaul and Kilabo to defend the incomplete airfield. Luckily for them, the airfield would prove a perfect defensive position that could neutralize the Japanese tanks, as they would get stuck in the mud, preventing them from participating in further assaults. In the early hours of August 28th, the Japanese would commence their assault of the well-defended Australian positions, yet the airstrip offered a wide and clear field of fire that aided the 25th Battalion in repelling the enemy. Soon they would be reinforced with the 61st Battalion, and would be further supported by Kittyhawks from the air, finally forcing the invaders to retreat east of Rabaul. During this battle, Clowes thought to be fighting an invasion force of 5,000 soldiers, but instead they were fighting a numerically inferior force of brave and determined men, whose plan of attack, centering on the use of their 2 tanks, worked wonders. But this was not to last, as the Australians were now preparing for their own counter-offensive. Back on August 10th, the Second Battle of Kokoda ended inconclusively, as the Australian soldiers of the 39th Battalion were forced to abandon Kokoda once again and retreat towards Deniki. Just 4 days later, their position at Deniki would be hard pressed by the enemy, finally forcing the defenders to withdraw towards Isurava, where Brigadier Potts took over command of Maroubra Force on August 23rd. At this point, Maroubra Force consisted of the remnants of the Papuan Battalion and of the 39th Battalion, as well as the recently arrived 53rd Battalion, with further reinforcements from Potts's 21st Brigade on their way. During the first few days of Potts's command, it took no time for him to realize the abysmal situation he was facing in regards to supply. Up until now, the Australians had been operating native carrier lines across the mountains, and they had built a major supply hub at Myola, where aircraft could easily carry and deliver the main burden of supply. Yet with the arrival of the new reinforcements, Potts required the transport of 200,000 pounds more of rations and ammunition, something that would require the employment of some 2,000 natives in more than 20 days. He believed only aircraft could save the situation, for the carriers clearly could not carry the required load. In response, MacArthur decided on August 24th to reinforce New Guinea with some 9 aircraft, yet this still required the service of thousands of carriers for the adequate maintenance of Maroubra and Kanga force. Moreover, bad weather prevented the planes many times from carrying their total number of daily trips, making the air supply operation very unreliable. This eventually forced Potts to relieve the exhausted 39th Battalion with the 2nd 14th Battalion, and to also commit his forces only for defensive operations, as offensives were impossible to carry out in such conditions. Yet before the 39th could be withdrawn, the Japanese were preparing to attack. Back on August 17th, the first echelon of the South Seas Detachment of General Horii departed Rabaul, escorted by a small cover force led by Admiral Mikawa. That same morning, Admiral Sukahara had conducted a powerful air raid over Port Moresby, effectively disabling all the Allied transports that were used to airdrop supplies. Despite the bad weather and a high swell, the convoy would successfully land Horii's forces at Basabua the following day, and by August 21st, the bulk of the South Seas Detachment would reach Kokoda. That same night, the first echelon of the Yazawa detachment would land at Basabua. These were men that had fought and defeated Australian forces in the Malayan Campaign, both at Gamas and Singapore, yet their late arrival would force Horii to hold them in reserve. Concurrent with the Allied supply problem, Horii was also facing an ordeal of his own. By September 2nd, 300 horses had been brought in, along with thousands of labourers from Formosa, Korea and New Britain, and some 300 tons of supplies had been warehoused at Buna, pending their transportation to Sonbo by truck, and then by pack horse or carrier to Kokoda. Yet Horii didn't believe there were sufficient carriers to get his forces to Port Moresby, and he knew he depended on supporting supplied provisions with what could be found in local villages and abandoned enemy camps. Meanwhile, Colonel Tsukamoto's men were enjoying the lull in the fighting, occasionally skirmishing with patrols of the 39th Battalion, now under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor. But with the arrival of Horii's forces to the battlefront, on the night of August 25th, the South Seas Detachment finally began its advance on Isurava. Horii planned to hold the main enemy force with a small unit at the front, while the bulk of his forces moved around to charge the enemy's flanks and rear during the night. At dawn on August 26th, the Japanese carried out a bombardment of Isurava with mortar fire, immediately followed by Tsukamoto's assault on the higher ridgelines in front of Isurava under heavy rain, while the 2nd Battalion of Major Horii advanced towards Abuari and rapidly captured Kailei and Mishima, easily overrunning the positions of the 53rd and causing much confusion in the battalion. Yet Tsukamoto's assault wasn't faring so well, as the cunning defenders targeted return fire on breaks in jungle cover, and also held their fire until the Japanese were at point-blank range to prevent their positions from being located. Nonetheless, the invaders managed to penetrate the Australian frontal positions during the night, while the rest of the 1st Battalion were slowly making their way around Isurava. The following day, the battle progressed, as Horii got to the Abuari Falls and started to bombard Alola across Eora Creek, something that forced the 53rd Battalion to send 2 companies to stop them. At this point, it's not known why Major Horii refused to take the initiative and assault Alola, though his forces were exhausted, giving the defenders the chance to establish better defensive positions and to reinforce the 53rd with the 2nd 16th Battalion. Potts actually found the fighting capabilities of the 53rd soldiers to be very poor and inadequate, so he was happy to replace them with the 2nd 16th, but he still called for the reserve 2nd 27th Battalion to be sent forward to reinforce him. Yet the difficult situation that the Australians were facing in Milne Bay forced Potts to fight with what he had. At the same time, the 2nd 14th was finally arriving to relieve the 36th Battalion, and they would slowly do so in the next few days. During the afternoon, Horii decided to send forward his 3rd Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Kawada Genichiro, to outflank the defenders along the creek, and it would soon join a furious assault on Isurava, breaking through the right flank of the Australians, and engaging them in vicious hand-to-hand combat. Luckily for the defenders, courageous men from the 39th launched 2 fierce counterattacks that managed to repel the invaders towards the creek, soon stabilizing the situation for the remainder of the day. On August 28th, the Japanese assaults and the heavy rain continued, with the Australians finally managing to repel Horii from the waterfall, and with the Japanese probing the defensive positions in search of weaknesses. Another breakthrough would be achieved by midday, but the tenacious defenders would yet again push the invaders back and restore their lost positions. Gradually, however, the Australians were being outflanked, and on August 29th, Horii's forces would start an all-out assault on Isurava. His men took the ridges the Australians had held and set up a lot of mortar and machine guns atop them to support the assault. The Australians were unable to respond to this and gradually were pushed back. Once again the Japanese breached the front lines, and once again they were repelled. Yet the invaders continued to press the weary and exhausted defenders, enveloping them with a succession of Japanese charges and gradually forcing them to shrink their perimeter. Although Potts was planning to send the 2nd 16th Battalion to counterattack the Japanese at Isurava, he finally had to allow his men to withdraw due to the relentless attacks of the enemy. By dusk and under heavy fire, the defenders began to withdraw under pouring rain towards a rest house between Isurava and Alola. Yet again, the 39th had shown its tenacity, and although they had suffered many casualties, they had inflicted many more on the invaders. At the same time, frustrated by the lack of progress, Horii deployed to the west a unit of the 41st Regiment, led by Major Koiwai Mitsuo, tasking him to envelop Alola. Aggressively, the Japanese then closely followed the Australian withdrawal on August 30th, with the rear elements of the Australians successfully holding them off while their comrades retreated. Major Horii also began to press at the waterfall, but the defenders held them off as well. Soon the retreating forces passed through Alola, and Potts decided to commence Maroubra's final withdrawal southwards to Eora village. During the withdrawal, many Australian units would get lost in the jungles, requiring several days to successfully rejoin the bulk of Maroubra Force. Yet many would also be killed by the savage Japanese, who would later execute them. By nightfall, the Japanese had secured Alola and had found there large amounts of food and ammunition, something that relieved Horii in regards to the supply problem. But in their desperation, the starving Japanese forces rushed to Alola and proceeded to devour all the food they could find. With the Battle of Isurava now over, both sides had suffered heavy casualties. The Japanese lost 140 men and had 230 wounded, while the Australians lost 100 men and had 110 wounded. And though the Japanese had won the battle, they couldn't allow themselves to waste 5 days taking Isurava if they wanted to effectively capture Port Moresby. By the morning of August 31st, the depleted 2nd 14th Battalion was in position about a mile south of Alola, and the 2nd 16th Battalion was halfway between Alola and Eora, while both the 36th and 53rd Battalions were sent further south towards Myola to be left out of the battle. On the other side, while the Japanese troops rested after the gruesome battle, Horii received an order from General Hyakutake to advance on the southern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range and hold that position until the second echelon of his forces arrived. Despite the high troop losses and increasing supply difficulties, Horii stubbornly decided to press on with the offensive, immediately ordering the Yazawa detachment to chase the enemy towards Eora Creek, with the Koiwai unit as its spearhead. Knowing that the invaders were coming for him, Potts decided to execute a fighting withdrawal, leapfrogging ambushes on the track as his forces dug in and carried out fanning movements around the Japanese before pulling back to some new positions. This was done to gain enough time to move the wounded and sick south and out of harm's way, as the Australians knew full well what the enemy would do to the wounded if they got their hands on them. By September 1st, the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th had finally reached Eora, establishing defensive positions south of the village on the high ground overlooking Templeton's Crossing. At this point, moving through the narrow and slippery track became increasingly difficult. The jungle got thicker, the humidity was unbearable, Rain fell almost every day and all night. The soldiers got wet through, shivering in the night and early morning cold. For the Japanese, each mile they gained was met with a fire exchange, losing a few more men as the Australians continued to retreat and set up ambushes. During the afternoon of September 1st, the 2nd 16th valiantly resisted the storming attacks of the enemy until midnight, while the depleted 2nd 14th fell back behind them and got half through to Templeton's Crossing. The next morning, the 2nd 16th would finally start their retreat, allowing the enemy to enter Iora village. There the Japanese found only abandoned huts, as the Australians were now destroying everything that couldn't be carried. This, coupled with the fact that provisions became damp and putrefied in the continual rain, further intensified Horii's supply problem, forcing the general to order a reduction in the daily rice ration. Soon, hunger and desperation began to take a heavy toll on Horii's men, their discipline getting looser as a result. In the meantime, the 2nd 16th's men fought their way to Templeton's Crossing, continuing their retreat further south until they relieved the 2nd 14th Battalion on the afternoon of September 3rd. At the Gap, a dip in the Owen Stanley about 7 miles wide, the 2nd 16th would soon be assaulted by the Koiwai unit. During this attack, however, Colonel Yazawa and Major Koiwai would argue about the best approach for the assault, losing valuable time as a torrential downpour began and forced both sides to rest for the night. Yet the Australians would soon withdraw towards Miola, so Koiwai would have the honour of being the first to cross the saddle of the Owen Stanley Range. For the Japanese, it was downhill from there towards Port Moresby, and their expected victory. The next objective, however, was Miola, the main supply hub of the Australians. As the 2nd 14th had already taken up defensive positions on Miola, the 2nd 16th would fight a series of rearguard actions against their pursuers during September 4th, finally arriving at the supply hub on the morning of September 5th. The exhausted Australian soldiers then proceeded to eat their fill of the stores, which were being destroyed to prevent their use by the enemy. Miola was a wide and flat alpine plain, full of reeds and devoid of trees, a spot that would be easily encircled. In fact, Koiwai and Yazawa were already planning to begin to work around the flanks of the defenders, so although it sickened him at the time, Potts made the correct decision to abandon Miola and withdraw further back towards Efoghi. During a violent storm, the Yazawa detachment then finally entered Miola, with the South Seas detachment quickly coming in behind them. Soaked and wet, the hungry Japanese soldiers rapidly fell upon the rations that were left behind. It's not known whether they had been contaminated or not by the Australians, but the troops were ill the next morning, suffering diarrhea from overeating the captured provisions. Back on August 24th, the Japanese had commenced their amphibious invasion of Milne Bay, aiming to occupy the airstrip at Rabaul to employ it for the overland drive against Port Moresby. Believing it to be held by few enemy soldiers, Admiral Mikawa only sent forward a small force of SNLF Marines, which would be vastly outnumbered by the Milne force of General Claus. But despite their numerical inferiority and the constant threat of enemy air attacks, the Japanese expertly employed their 2 Hago tanks to support their brave assaults against the Australian positions, reaching the Rabaul airstrip by August 28th. Now, however, the strength of the defenders was beginning to show, and they would soon prepare for an all-out counterattack, one that would drastically change the course of the battle. During the initial days of the Battle of Milne Bay, the Japanese had to lay low for the day to escape the incessant attacks of the enemy Kittyhawks, but in the night, pitch black due to the low rain clouds that covered the moon, the invaders stirred like vampires and, under an intermittent rain, silently moved into position to commence their determined assaults against the enemy. This strategy worked wonders for Commander Hayashi, successfully pushing back the defenders towards the Gamma River by August 27th. But in the early hours of August 28th, as the Japanese advanced into the Rabaul airfield, their tanks got repeatedly bogged down in the sodden track, their engines showing signs of strain after pushing all day through the mud. Inevitably, both tanks would become irretrievably stuck near Rabaul, and the troops would have to continue without the strong support of their tanks. Consequently, their brave assault would be repelled by the tough Australian defenders, and with the sun rising, the Kittyhawks appeared again and the Japanese were scattered while they fled to find shelter. A quiet day followed as the exhausted Japanese rested and continued to move their supplies under the cover of the jungles. Yet the threat of the Japanese incursion now finally forced General Clowes to evacuate his aircraft towards Port Moresby. By nightfall, the depleted 61st Battalion stood in defence of the northwestern end of the Rabaul airfield, and the 25th Battalion was to the southeast, while a small reserve force covered their rear across the creek, and the 2nd 12th and 2nd 9th Battalions, along with 2 companies of the 9th Battalion, were sent forward to prepare a counterattack against the enemy. Meanwhile, the Japanese were facing a deadly supply problem that forced Hayashi to reduce the rations to dry biscuits. He also believed that the Tsukioka unit had landed at Taupota and was advancing on the hills north of Rabaul, but alas, this was not the case, and it wouldn't be until September 2nd that Tsukioka could send 3 messengers on a canoe paddling towards Buna. Although Admiral Mikawa had attempted to solve this problem on the night of August 27th, sending the destroyer Hamikaze with supplies towards Rabaul, the ensuing struggle at the airstrip prevented the Japanese from contacting the destroyer, and subsequently it would have to depart without landing its cargo. Now, Mikawa sought to reinforce Hayashi with a further 760 SNLF Marines, led by Commander Yano Minoru. Despite the air raids of the Australians, the convoy landed at Wagga Wagga during the night of August 29th, with the surface forces of Admiral Matsuyama shelling the Allied positions around Gili Gili until midnight. In the meantime, the Australians had discovered the 2 enemy tanks, bogged and abandoned on the track, and they were preparing to counterattack. Yet Clowes felt much uncertainty about the enemy ship activity at the harbour, and despite pressures by Generals Blamey and MacArthur, he believed that further landings to the west were still possible, and thus this prevented him from committing half of his forces to destroy the enemy presence east of Rabaul. In the end, no counterattack materialized, and by the night of August 30th, Hayashi and Yano were preparing to renew their advance. The SNLF Marines quickly moved to assault the airstrip again, but they were met with the tracer fire of American armoured vehicles and with mortar and machine gun fire from the Australian defenders. Shocked by the heavy Allied firepower, the Japanese attempted 3 banzai charges nonetheless, and they suffered many casualties for it, including that of Commander Hayashi. Taking over command, Yano then directed his forces to outflank the 61st's men. Yet the Australians quickly realized this, and placing some forces along the high ground, rapidly pushed them back again. Alerted by 3 bugle calls that the Kittyhawks were arriving, the Japanese finally had to withdraw in a state of disarray into the jungles, having suffered severe casualties in the senseless slaughter. As the sun edged up, the battlefield was left full of corpses and wounded Japanese, who would subsequently be shot by the Australians, who judged that their enemy had done the same many times before. During the late morning, the 2nd 12th Battalion at last arrived at the front lines, and with Clowes finally deciding to launch his counterattack, it began a ruthless advance eastward, harassed by Japanese snipers and machine gunners. By afternoon, all opposition had been crushed, and the Australians had reached the Gamma River, with the Japanese, still in disarray, falling back further east behind the KB mission. Such was their shell shock that the invaders hadn't even realized that the enemy Kittyhawks didn't appear that morning. In the late afternoon, however, as the Australians entered into KB mission, the Kittyhawks finally arrived from Port Moresby and began to strafe the enemy positions. Meanwhile, Yano's SNLF Marines, which hadn't withdrawn the rest of their forces, were now reaching the Gamma River, and to their surprise, they were ambushed there by a company of the 9th Battalion, suffering heavy casualties. They finally broke through beyond KB mission, but Yano was seriously injured during the struggle. On the morning of September 1st, the Japanese would continue to fall back towards the easternmost tip of New Guinea through a series of holding positions, with the Australians in hot pursuit. At the same time, Clowes received false information from MacArthur that the enemy may land more forces west of Gili Gili, so he decided to recall the 2nd 9th Battalion and hold it in reserve. The following day, as Mikawa prepared to send a further 130 SNLF Marines, Yano got to communicate the dire situation his forces were in. These small reinforcements were then cancelled, and Mikawa met with General Hyakutake to send the Alba detachment to reinforce the SNLF Marines, which were going to arrive at Rabaul on September 9th. Thus, Yano was ordered to hold on until September 12th. Yet the Australians were continuing their incursions further east. Clowes also finally allowed the 2nd 9th to be sent forward across the bay in 2 small boats, relieving the 2nd 12th when they arrived. Luckily for the invaders, the narrowness of the coastal corridor slowed the enemy and prevented them from flanking the exhausted Japanese. Both sides suffered many losses in the firefight, but the Japanese would successfully manage to hold on by September 4th. During the night of September 3rd, 2 destroyers would also enter the bay to evacuate the wounded, with Commander Yano among them. The following night, after a long day resisting the outflanking attacks of the 2nd 9th Battalion, another Japanese destroyer entered the harbour to evacuate more wounded and to gather accurate information about their state. Now Mikawa knew that all of the company commanders had been killed, and that only 50 men fully fit remained in the force, and he had to concede that the situation was unsustainable, ordering Admiral Matsuyama to evacuate the landing force. Consequently, the Japanese retreated behind Wagga Wagga on September 5th, preparing for the evacuation. By midday, the Australians captured Wagga Wagga and continued to skirmish with the invaders, as the SNLF Marines used their last strength to keep the enemy at bay and then pull back slowly. On September 6th, only minor skirmishes would be fought, but the Australians were now in the main supply area of the Japanese, among dumps and scattered paraphernalia, and they knew that the battle was over. During that night, Matsuyama's forces entered into the harbour with a platoon of fresh troops to cover the evacuation. Consequently, the freighter Anshun was caught unaware while unloading cargo, getting fired upon by the Japanese vessels and finally sinking at the wharf. The evacuation then proceeded without enemy resistance, and the surviving SNLF Marines, most of them wounded, now sighed in relief, happy to be alive. Yet Operation RE had been a complete failure, one of Japan's first land defeats of the war, and after the other defeats at Midway and the Southern Solomons, this could only show that the tide was turning in favour of the Allies. The Australian victory at Milne Bay also meant that General Horii would not receive any support in his overland drive against Port Moresby, as the Japanese now decided to focus on Guadalcanal rather than on a second amphibious attack against New Guinea. And back to the Kokoda Track, Brigadier Potts and his Maroubra Force continued to prepare their new defensive positions at Ifogi after the withdrawal from Isurava and the abandonment of the main supply base at Myola. Luckily for him, with the Milne Bay situation now under control, General Rabaul at last dispatched the 2nd 27th Battalion to reinforce Potts's position. On September 4th, 2 companies of the battalion arrived at Kagi, but they would have to immediately withdraw southwards as the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th made their way towards Ifogi. By the afternoon of September 5th, the 2nd 27th finally established solid defensive positions on Mission Ridge, a high ground south of Ifogi, while the rest of the Maroubra Force fell further back to guard the rear of the 2nd 27th at Brigade Hill. The following night, the dug-in Australian soldiers witnessed a threatening column of small lights snaking slowly down the black slope as they made their way to Ifogi River at the bottom of the valley, a disarming sight that indicated that Horii's renewed assault was incoming. Soon, the invaders occupied the deserted village of Ifogi and began to probe and fire at the Australian positions. Yet the Japanese procession was also strafed and bombed by 8 marauders and 4 Kittyhawks on the morning of September 7th, suffering considerable casualties as they moved down this Hell Valley. Although this was an unusually wide valley, the canopy made pinpointing Japanese positions difficult, so the Allied aircraft would be far less successful from this point onwards. Nonetheless, it was a bad situation for General Horii, as he couldn't request air support for the offensive because the message had to be taken by a runner back to Kokoda in a 3-day trip to where the nearest radio transmitter was located. In turn, Horii decided to send the 2nd Battalion up the western foot of Brigade Hill to cut off the enemy retreat, while the 3rd Battalion launched a frontal assault on Mission Ridge. At night, while Japanese artillery bombarded the Australian positions in preparation for the assault, Major Horii began his difficult advance up the western flank, forced to crawl because of the steepness of the ridge. Yet despite its difficulty, Horii had successfully scaled the ridge's forested side well before dawn, cutting off the 3 Australian battalions from their headquarters and immediately starting to dig foxholes along the side of the track to fire at the enemy in front. In the meantime, the main assault of the South Seas Detachment had started in the early hours of September 8th. The Japanese soldiers relentlessly attacked the Australian positions, but each time the defenders managed to repel them with grenades and rifle fire. Eventually, however, the 2nd 27th began to concede terrain against the hammering of the invaders. At this point, Potts realized his forces had been cut off, so he ordered the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th to break through Horii's positions. Amidst a bombardment by Japanese artillery and under heavy rain, the Australians charged against the Japanese positions, but only one company would manage to break through to headquarters. By late afternoon, Potts' headquarters began to withdraw towards Minari, while the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th remained pinned down and had to retreat under heavy fire through a narrow track to the east, steep and closed in with dense bush. Elements of the 2nd 27th were also ordered to gradually retreat, yet the confusion of the situation saw the battalion withdrawing in disorder all at once. This was an unmitigated disaster for the Australians, who suffered high losses in the entire battle. The Japanese then followed in hot pursuit, inflicting more casualties on the retreating defenders, but 2 Australian companies covering the side track would eventually hold them off, as Maroubra Force made its way down the track, slashing through the undergrowth and carrying back their wounded in the drizzling rain. At dusk, the 2 companies of the 2nd 27th launched a fierce counterattack that threw the invaders into a temporary confusion, gaining enough time for Potts' forces to safely retreat. On the morning of September 9th, the first elements of the Australian battalions began to arrive at Minari, but because of the hot pursuit of the enemy, Potts was now forced to continue the withdrawal southwards towards Isurava. With the battle at Brigade Hill over, the first supplies from Sonbo began to arrive to quell the hunger of the Japanese troops. But Horii's supply problem was only getting worse. Air attacks on the track and on the ships coming from Rabaul strained the Japanese supply line, and desertions by native carriers further complicated Horii's situation. Because of this supply problem, General Hyakutake had ordered Horii to halt on the southern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range. But determined to end the campaign, Horii decided to press on south towards Port Moresby, despite the state of his supply line. This decision was probably based on his desire for vengeance, due to the high casualties that his forces had suffered in the last engagements, and because Horii also wanted to avoid the disgrace of being defeated by the Australians. His forces would then clash with the retreating defenders at the Maguli Range, but this wouldn't stop the Australian retreat towards Isurava, where a final confrontation was looming on the horizon. The situation on the Kokoda Track was very grim for both the Japanese and for the Australians. General Horii's South Seas Detachment had successfully defeated the defenders at Isurava, Iora and Ifogi, but the engagements had been very bloody, leaving the Japanese with a large number of casualties, and delaying their advance for more time than Horii could afford. This is because the invaders were facing a dire situation in regards to the supply problem. Air attacks on the track and the desertion of native carriers strained Horii's supply line and brought it ever closer to a complete collapse, so the Japanese soldiers were starving, supplementing their dwindling rations with raids on village gardens along the road, and with the supplies that the Australians left behind as they retreated southwards. Horii also had orders to stop his advance on the southern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range, both because of the supply dilemma and because the Japanese High Command was worried about the recent defeats on Guadalcanal, a theatre which they were beginning to prioritise. Yet the relentless commander of the South Seas Detachment decided to press on south towards Port Moresby, driven by his desire to exert vengeance on the stubborn enemy and thus avoid the disgrace of defeat. Port Moresby also meant food and shelter for his men, an end to the supply problem that had plagued his offensive from the beginning. With his forward units already in hot pursuit of the retreating enemy forces, Horii was now preparing to resume his advance towards Port Moresby, not knowing that he was reaching the end of the line. As for the Australians, Brigadier Potts had been forced to abandon his main supply base at Myola, so he was also facing a difficult supply situation. The enemy had been advancing in force, and although he and his 21st Brigade had been offering much resistance ever since the defense of Isurava, his forces were rapidly dwindling due to the strong Japanese attacks. Diseases like malaria and dysentery were also plaguing both the Australian and Japanese forces, inflicting more casualties than the actual battles themselves. By September 9th, the bulk of the Maroubra Force finally regrouped at Minari with the invaders in hot pursuit, and executing a strong mortar barrage, although the 2nd 27th Battalion had been cut off during the retreat and had to subsequently traverse through the jungle until they arrived at Jararere on September 22nd. From Minari, Potts would have to continue his withdrawal southwards because of his exposed position against enemy attacks, with the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions taking new defensive positions on the Maguli Range between Nauru and Iori Baiwa. Meanwhile, General Rabaul continued to deal with the administrative problems at Port Moresby, trying to build a stable supply line despite the few maps and transport aircraft at hand. With the enemy slowly but surely advancing along the Kokoda Track, Rabaul's small but experienced staff was beginning to comprehend how enormous their task of defending New Guinea was. To add to all his problems, General MacArthur requested from Brisbane to be informed with a ball-to-ball description of the situation. Yet Rabaul opposed this, and he instead sent only factual information at stated times. Without knowing exactly what was happening, but seeing that the Japanese advance still continued, General MacArthur started to doubt the capabilities of Rabaul and of Maroubra Force, planning to replace both of them as soon as possible. On September 10th, Rabaul also decided to recall Potts because of the disaster at Brigade Hill, appointing Brigadier Porter to again take command of Maroubra Force. The Australians then continued their withdrawal towards the higher ground at Iori Baiwa, with the Japanese still close behind them. While the 2nd 16th prepared an ambush, the 2nd 14th was holding off a strong Japanese attack coming from 3 sides at the Maguli Range. Suffering many casualties, the defenders eventually withdrew, and their pursuers found in the Offie Creek some scattered supplies left behind by the Australians. But it was a trap, and as the Japanese desperately fell onto the rations, they were fired upon from several directions and had to retreat. This gained enough time for Porter's men to safely arrive at the Iori Baiwa Ridge by September 12th, where they were reinforced by 2 infantry battalions and a special force under Colonel Honor, the last commander of the formidable 39th Battalion. To help Porter stabilise the situation, Rabaul was also sending the 25th Brigade of Brigadier Ken Ether to reinforce him, which would finally arrive at Iori Baiwa by September 14th, while the Honor Force was also sent forward through the Goldie River to cut off the enemy line of communications at Minari. At the Iori Baiwa Ridge, Porter deployed the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions, with the 3rd and 2nd 33rd Battalions protecting their right flank, and with the 2nd 31st Battalion guarding their left flank. Finally, the 2nd 25th Battalion was left in reserve at the rear, preparing to be the one to spearhead a counterattack along the track towards Nauru, with the other 2 battalions of the 25th Brigade tasked with outflanking the invaders. In the meantime, Horii set up a mountain gun high on the northern slope of the Offie Creek Valley, starting a heavy bombardment of the Australian positions at Iurubaiwa. On September 14th, the South Seas Detachment began its first charges against the enemy, with the 3rd Battalion of Colonel Kawada attacking the main position at Iurubaiwa, and the 2nd Battalion of Major Horii attempting a flanking move towards the west. Kawada had little success at first, as the higher ground enabled the defenders to keep his men at bay with grenades and gunfire. But the Japanese would relentlessly continue to charge, finally gaining a foothold, although they would be unable to press the advantage any further. On the other side, the 2nd 31st had swung off the track in the morning, trying to outflank the invaders, yet they were rapidly engaged by Horii's unit, and were at last forced to retreat back towards the crest of the ridge, where they managed to hold their position against the strong attacks of the enemy. The following day, Kawada sent a platoon towards the eastern flank, finding there a long line of Australian defences, manned by the 2nd 33rd and 3rd Battalions. Despite this, the Japanese quickly found a weak point in the line, where a militia unit had put its weapons to the side and hadn't posted sentries while digging deeper. Rushing over, the Japanese platoon rapidly overcame the militia unit and seized this high point along the ridgeline, from where the invaders could fire down on defensive positions in both directions along the line. In response, Ether ordered the 2nd 25th Battalion to counterattack and dislodge the enemy from this position, while the 2nd 33rd drove to the left to outflank them. Yet the ruggedness of the terrain prevented the 2nd 33rd from making any progress, and the 2nd 25th would have to assault the strong Japanese position by itself, losing many men, and finally getting pushed back. Meanwhile in the centre, the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions were under much pressure from the Japanese, who had crept close with machine guns, and their powerful artillery was inflicting many casualties on them. And to the west, the 2nd 31st was facing a similar situation. At the same time, the supply problem was becoming serious for the defenders, as air supply was impossible in these conditions. The native carriers refused to move to the front lines, and lack of water was lowering the strength of the Australians. By September 16th, the fighting at Iurubaiwa had reached a stalemate, as either side was failing to break through with flanking attacks. Yet the Japanese continued to strain harder at the Australian positions, and the battered 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions were beginning to get pushed back after 3 weeks of heavy fighting. Ether and Porter didn't believe they could hold off the enemy much longer, even despite their numerical superiority, so they finally elected to withdraw farther back towards Imita Ridge. About this decision, Ether reasoned that if he continued to hold Iurubaiwa, then all his forces would be committed to the defensive, preventing him from preparing for any offensive operations. He also wanted to gain more time to relieve the exhausted men from the 21st Brigade and to prepare better defensive positions from which to launch his counter-offensive. Unbeknownst to him, the Japanese were also facing a dilemma. Aside from their breakthrough to the east, they hadn't made much progress against the enemy, and the Japanese commanders were beginning to understand that they were outnumbered and lacked reserves to continue their assaults. Despite this, Major General Arthur Allen of the 7th Australian Division finally approved Ether's request to fall further back towards Amita Ridge, but warned that this position was to be held to the death. Thus, the fresh 2nd 25th Battalion was brought forward to the Iurubaiwa Ridge to protect the withdrawal of the bulk of Maroubra Force. By late afternoon, the 2nd 25th also began to fall back, with the 2nd 33rd Battalion forming a rearguard, while the rest of the brigade struggled through the heavy rain and the slippery track of the Waule Creek. The following day, Australian forces had successfully deployed on Imita Ridge, with the 3rd and 2nd 33rd Battalions to the east, the 2nd 25th in the centre, and the 2nd 31st to the west, reinforced with the 2nd 1st Pioneer Battalion. With the withdrawal of Porter's 21st Brigade southwards, Ether also took formal command of Maroubra Force at this point. In the meantime, the Honor Force was carrying out a difficult journey through the muddy tracks and dense jungle, and by September 19th, they would arrive at the vicinity of Amaramara. Yet the men were exhausted and lacked sufficient supplies, horses, and suitable airdrop ground to continue forward, so they would be unable to move from there. Honor was told not to go beyond the limits of the rations he was given. For the Japanese, however, the victory had been surprising, and they knew now that behind Imita stood Port Moresby, the objective and obsession of their invasion. In that regard, the officers were readying their men for a final desperate charge toward Port Moresby. Yet back on September 14th, worried about the supply problem, and fearing that with the recent defeats on Guadalcanal, the Americans might take the initiative to invade Buna, the Japanese High Command had decided to cancel the Port Moresby offensive and to reassemble the South Seas Detachment north of the Owen Stanleys in protection of Buna. On September 16th, however, General Hyakutake sent the wrong order to Horii, indicating that he was to halt his advance to secure Ioribawa and then prepare for a future offensive. Port Moresby was so close, but so far away at the same time, and Horii had no other choice but to stop his advance at Ioribawa because his supply line had virtually ground to a halt and his men were on the brink of starvation. His troops on the ridge, meanwhile, dug their distinctive foxholes and trenches and then started to send patrols forward. For the next couple of days, there would be only small-scale actions, and the Australians would finally solidify their position at Imita. With the strength of his men ebbing for lack of food, and with discipline getting harder to maintain, Horii would have to appeal to their military pride with encouraging speeches so as to maintain their fighting spirit. The Japanese commander also knew that the enemy had amassed more than 20,000 troops in Port Moresby, and that Tokyo was probably not going to send any more resources to New Guinea because of the prioritization of the Guadalcanal theatre. The bad weather of the region was also preventing the airlift of food supplies from Rabaul, with only one attempt successfully dropping supplies on Kokoda on September 23rd. Finally, on September 24th, orders from Generals Imamura and Hyakutake would arrive, telling Horii to withdraw from Ioribawa towards the Isurava-Kokoda area and to strengthen the defences in Buna. Horii was adamant not to carry out these orders, after all the blood that had been shed to get them there, but after getting a signal by the Emperor himself, he had to crushingly prepare for his withdrawal. At the same time, General MacArthur was very angry about Rabaul's decision to not constantly inform him about the situation in New Guinea, and he was concerned about what he perceived as a lack of efficiency by Australian forces. Thus he decided to send General Blamey to take personal command of the New Guinea force, and he also wanted to send US forces to Port Moresby to offer more resistance against the Japanese advance. General Rabaul would be allowed to keep command of the 1st Corps, but he took this situation very badly, stating that Blamey came to New Guinea when the tide was on the turn, and that he would be recognized for it without actually having done anything. A very strange situation then continued between the two men, and on September 28th, Blamey would finally relieve Rabaul from his command because of his non-cooperative attitude, replacing him with Lieutenant General Edmund Herring. In response to the Japanese passivity, Ether had also sent forward the 2nd 25th Battalion with caution along the track, successfully gaining some ground by September 25th to start an artillery bombardment of the Japanese positions. The Australians then began to move forward in preparation for an offensive against Ioribawa, but on September 26th, Horii finally began his withdrawal. The South Seas Detachment had never retreated before, and Horii had no protocol for retreat, so he had to devise an ad hoc plan to meet the circumstances, planning to execute a fighting withdrawal like the one the enemy had been carrying out along the Kokoda Track. On September 28th, Ether's attacks against Ioribawa then began as planned, but they found there no opposition at all, and also much equipment left behind by the retreating invaders. After so many gruesome delaying actions, after the loss of so many courageous men who sacrificed their lives to gain time, a minute, an hour, a day, the task was at last complete. Yet the men knew that much fighting still lay ahead of them, but the threat to Port Moresby had at last been removed. With the Japanese withdrawal, the Australians had suffered their true baptism of fire in the Pacific War. Back on September 24th, the Japanese withdrawal from Ioribawa had begun. The 2nd Battalion of Major Horii would be the first to pull back, forming the Stanley Detachment early on with some other units. Their objective was to set up defensive positions leading to the high ground overlooking Eora Creek, so that they could delay any Australian pursuit of withdrawing troops. The 3rd Battalion of Colonel Kawada would then start to retreat by September 26th, with the Koiwai Battalion protecting its rear, and with one of its companies advancing 500 meters as rearguard cover to disguise the withdrawal. 2 days later, the Australian counterattack began, but they were surprised to find no Japanese opposition at Yoribaiwa. Brigadier Ether then rapidly occupied the area with his forces, and although there was no immediate pursuit of the enemy because they were wary of advancing into a trap, patrols were sent forward as far as Nauru, where they also discovered no Japanese presence at all. As for the invaders, their withdrawal was carried out under dreadful physical conditions, as the troops of the South Seas Detachment were completely exhausted, they almost didn't have any food, and they also had to carry their wounded on stretchers all the way back over the Owen Stanley Range. Every step seemed to sap the last of each soldier's strength, so climbing even the smallest hill required a great effort. In the last days of September, General Horii's men would slowly trail up and along the Maguli Range before reaching the hazardous ravines and razorbacks of Eora Creek. By the beginning of October, the Australians were also pushing once more across the Kokoda Track, and at the same time, General MacArthur was planning to employ the 126th and 128th Regiments, which had previously landed in September under the 1st Corps of Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, to support the counter-offensive of General Allen's 7th Division, with the objective of driving the Japanese northwards to the Kamusi River line. Yet the problem of supply, required to bring these forces to the front, continued to haunt the Allied command, so General Blamey instead intended to use only the 25th and 16th Brigades for the immediate counter-offensive. Only one American battalion would be sent along the Jora Trail to cut off the Japanese retreat at Wairopi, yet the difficult jungle terrain would make them arrive too late and weakened to fight. Furthermore, a special unit would be flown to Wanagela on October 5th to establish a forward base from where the Americans could join the counter-offensive from a 3rd line of advance. By October 2nd, meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion had occupied Nauru and its leading company was at Minari, continuing to Afogi without opposition. Not long after Afogi was occupied, patrols from the 3rd and 2nd 25th Battalions clashed with the Japanese rearguard between Miola and Templeton's Crossing on October 8th, but the Australians would be easily repelled, forced to retreat back to Miola. Because of this, and because of the supply problem, Brigadier Ether had to wait to assemble his 4 battalions at Ifogi before continuing forward. In the end, Allen would order him to concentrate on Kagi and Miola to await for the arrival of the 16th Brigade of Brigadier John Lloyd, while Allen and General Herring sought to build a reserve with an accelerated air supply program. At the same time, Horii had been ordered to set up an offensive base at Isurava and to secure defensive positions in the Buna and Girua areas, from where the Japanese offensive would restart. But the retreat had plummeted the Japanese morale. The soldiers felt abandoned by their superiors, and thus many were deserting and running away. In these conditions, no Japanese offensive would ever commence. As Horii's forces finally started to reach Isurava, the Stanley Detachment had also successfully completed defensive preparations around Eora Creek, setting up many holding positions on strategic points of both tracks leading to Templeton's Crossing. On October 11th, Ether sent the 2nd 33rd and 2nd 25th Battalions to seize Templeton's Crossing, with the first contact occurring on the moss forests of the Miola Arm. Although the Australians pushed their way as noiselessly as possible in search of machine gun pits, the Japanese managed to hold tenaciously from one-man holes, which were effectively camouflaged with branches, leaves and grass. On the Kagi track, some 150 Japanese soldiers had also dug in along the ridge of Mount Bellamy, and they would also have to repel the Australians on October 13th. The high ground effectively enabled them preemptive fire on any approaching enemy, and the steepness of the ridges prevented outflanking. Yet they also had to endure heavy and incessant downpours that made it difficult to see a patrol approaching. Despite this, the Japanese snipers had successfully pinned down the 2nd 25th by October 14th, when a particularly heavy rain unexpectedly brought a lull in the action. The following day, Ether decided to send the 3rd Battalion to attack the enemy and break through their left flank. Yet, unbeknownst to him, the Japanese had taken advantage of the unexpected downpour to withdraw from their positions into a second line at Templeton's Crossing, thus expertly employing the same delaying tactics that they had suffered during the Kokoda Track offensive. Finding no enemy opposition, the Australians then arduously pushed forward through the mud and against mortar fire, arriving at Templeton's Crossing on October 16th. The following morning, the 3rd Battalion led the attack against the entrenched Stanley detachment, which had been reinforced with an additional battalion, achieving some early gains against the invaders with grenades and machine gun fire. From some heavily fortified and camouflaged bunkers, the Japanese would continue to offer staunch resistance, even attempting some counterattacks that inflicted many casualties on the enemy. Still, the Australians continued to advance against the intense Japanese fire, gradually pushing back the invaders towards their final line at Yora village. At this point, General Allen was receiving much pressure from MacArthur and Blamey, as they felt that he wasn't attacking with sufficient energy, but the Australians still decided to wait until the 16th Brigade could arrive to relieve Ether's spent forces. On October 19th, the 2nd Battalion was the first to arrive to the battlefield to assist the 3rd Battalion against the Japanese counterattacks. While Lloyd's other forces relieved the 2nd 25th and 2nd 23rd Battalions, the Australians on the front then commenced a series of fierce attacks that slowly pushed back the enemy. After a heavy firefight, and with the Australians getting nearer and nearer to their defensive line, the Japanese would have to withdraw again during a lull in the fighting on the night of October 20th, this time to their last line on the other side of the Iora Creek ravine. By October 20th, the 3 battalions of the 16th Brigade had also finally concentrated at Templeton's Crossing, and now Lloyd was officially taking command of Maroubra Force from Brigadier Ether to resume the offensive with his own battalions. The following morning, the Australians cautiously resumed their attacks, but were again surprised to find that the enemy was gone. They then continued pushing along the track, only to find small clusters of Japanese soldiers waiting in ambush, thus losing many scalps against the surprise fire of the enemy. At this point, the problem of supply continued to haunt both forces, and the village gardens on the track that had sustained the combatants before had now been already plundered during the Japanese offensive. Although the Australians were also very hungry, the Japanese were much worse. On the verge of starvation, they dragged the bodies of the Australians killed in recent skirmishes back to their dugouts, like wild animals taking dead prey to their lairs. In the meantime, General Horii had positioned his main defences on the northern ridge, overlooking Iora village, spreading his men along and below the ridge to stall the enemy advance. From their network of machine gun posts and fire trenches up above, the Japanese had a clear view of arrivals on the ridge to the south, something that would be deadly for the Australians. On the morning of October 22nd, 2 companies of the 2nd 3rd Battalion entered Iora village, getting completely surprised as mortar and machine gun fire raked them. The Australians then tried to work up the ridge above the Japanese on the left, but by early afternoon they were blocked by the defenders, forced to concentrate on the southern ridge, where they were unexpectedly pounded with mortars and shells. Many losses were inflicted on the startled Australians during this action, resulting in a disorderly withdrawal back up the slope. Assessing the situation, Brigadier Lloyd decided to order a frontal attack across 2 log bridges that crossed Iora Creek, a plan that was disliked by his battalion commanders, but that had been forced upon him and upon General Allen by the pressures of MacArthur and Blamey. During the night, however, as the Australians had shown no inclination to do night attacks, the Japanese had retired under a heavy rain to positions behind the second bridge, intending to return just before dawn. At 0200 on October 23rd, the rain ceased, and the Australians quickly started their attack. Some patrols of the 2nd 1st and 2nd 3rd Battalions rapidly got to secure the bridges ahead unopposed, and taking advantage of the situation, the 2nd 1st then began to move to the other side before the enemy could realize what was happening. Eventually, the Japanese started to open fire from above, but the darkness prevented them from stopping the enemy. Furthermore, 2 companies had also swung off the track earlier, one to reach Olola by bypassing the main Japanese positions, and the other to outflank the enemy on the left. At the same time, the 2nd 1st soldiers were moving blindly and dodging bullets as they went. By dawn, after overcoming much opposition below the ridge, they would find themselves precariously dug in and largely pinned down in front of the main Japanese position. Hemmed in, the Australians would continue to resist for several days in a battle of attrition that inflicted considerable losses on both sides, with neither moving decisively forward nor back. In this stalemate, Lloyd ordered the 2nd 3rd Battalion to move to a high ground to the west and then attack down on the Japanese positions. Facing much opposition, however, the Australians would struggle to break through to the top, although they were beginning to apply heavy pressure on the enemy. Meanwhile, Horii moved his forces back 500 meters to stronger positions on a steeper part of the slope, and he also reinforced them with the Koiwai Battalion on October 26th. He would then prepare his forces for a final withdrawal towards Kokoda 2 days later, with the Koiwai Battalion acting as rearguard. On October 27th, 2 companies of the 2nd 1st Battalion and a company of the 2nd 2nd joined the 2nd 3rd as the Japanese withdrew to their more compact position. Although the Australians quickly pushed forward to break through, they would be easily stopped at a great cost in men. Yet the pressure was now increasing with each passing hour, and the Japanese would only just manage to hold their positions until the date of the withdrawal. The Australians, however, were also in a very bad situation, as they were always wet from the cold and rain, and they couldn't even light fires lest they became clear targets for the Japanese mortars. The incessant rain also turned the already turbulent waters of the creek into a raging torrent that destroyed the bridges, so the movement of supplies and wounded back and forth was severely hampered. At first light on October 28th, as Horii's 1st and 2nd Battalion began to disengage and retreat, the Australians renewed their attack with much more ferocity and in a coordinated manner. Colonel Kawada to the west bore the brunt of the attack, caught between 2 companies of the 2nd 3rd Battalion that had managed to climb onto higher ground, until a dense mist rolled in to mask the final withdrawal of the defenders. Many of these troops would, however, get lost in the dark jungle, and they would only manage to rejoin their battalion below Isurava 2 days later. On the morning of October 29th, Australian patrols finally found that the Japanese had abandoned their positions, thus ending the engagement. From this battle, it is reported that the Australians suffered almost twice as many casualties as their enemy, and this is often attributed to Lloyd's criticised decision to launch a frontal attack at Yora Creek. But we must also understand that Horii had expertly set up ideal defensive positions that were strongly and tenaciously manned by his men. And in the end, General Allen would also be replaced as commander of the 7th Division by Major General George Vassie on October 28th, as Blamey and MacArthur felt that his progress hadn't been fast enough for their liking. Thus Allen joined Potts and Rabaul as the 3rd man that was purged by Blamey and MacArthur due to alleged incompetence, when these 3 men were actually the main reason that the Japanese could be successfully delayed and exhausted long enough for their offensive to fail and for the Australians to finally start their counter-offensive. After the Japanese withdrawal, the 16th Brigade would then continue their advance in hot pursuit of the enemy, capturing and setting up their new main supply base at Olola by the end of the month. Meanwhile, Horii would continue past Kokoda during his withdrawal, as the major town was extremely vulnerable to an attack from behind. The retreating Japanese headed instead to the high ground around Oivi, near the Kamusi River, where the South Seas Detachment would prepare for its final stand. Back in late August, we'll recall that during the invasion of Milne Bay, some 353 SNLF Marines, under Commander Tsukioka Torishige, had been left stranded at Goodenough Island when 9 Australian Kitty Hawks destroyed all 7 of their landing barges, their radios, and most of its stores. Admiral Mikawa then attempted to rescue them on September 10th, but his destroyers were attacked by some Allied bombers that managed to sink the Yayoi. With their strength waning each day due to low rations and outbreaks of malaria, the SNLF Marines were kept alive through airdrops of supplies and food. Additionally, the submarine I-1 dropped off supplies and a radio on October 3rd, taking 71 sick or wounded back to Rabaul. Meanwhile, as General MacArthur continued to prepare his counter-offensive on New Guinea, Milne Force was directed to occupy and hold Goodenough Island and the south of Cape Nelson to deny their use by enemy forces. Thus, General Clowes appointed the 2nd 12th Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Arnold to undertake Operation Drake, with the objective of destroying all Japanese forces on the island. On October 22nd, the Drake Force was transported to Goodenough Island by Task Force 44, finally arriving that same night. To trap the Japanese, Arnold would land one small force of 120 men at Taleba Bay, while the bulk of his battalion landed at Mud Bay. The Australians would then set out on a grueling march under a violent thunderstorm towards Kilia, but they would make very slow progress. At 08:30 on October 23rd, as they crossed a creek in front of a steep hill, Arnold's men were ambushed with a strong grenade attack that forced him to pull back. He would later reform and continue his drive to Kilia, but with Japanese aircraft strafing his positions and casualties mounting up, Arnold at last decided to press his attack on October 24th. Meanwhile, the Taleba Bay force rapidly managed to drive the enemy from near Bulu Creek, but a series of heavy Japanese counterattacks finally pushed them back all the way to Taleba Bay, where they would have to board the Stuart to escape getting overrun. With the Australian forces unable to advance, the Japanese would withdraw during the night, successfully arriving at the nearby Ferguson Island by October 25th. From there, 261 survivors would finally be rescued by the light cruiser Tenryu the following day. Meeting no opposition, Arnold's men would then go on to swiftly secure the island. Upon assuming command of the 7th Division, General Vassie then ordered the 25th Brigade to lead the pursuit of the enemy forces towards Kokoda, while the 16th Brigade rested for the eventual capture of Oivi and the establishment of a bridgehead over the Kamusi River. By the end of October, the 2nd 1st and 2nd 2nd Battalions had secured Alola and Isurava, so the Australians now had recuperated one of their main dropping areas for supply, although the percentage of recovery there was still low. They would then continue along the right fork of the track towards Misima, leaving Isurava as a staging ground for Brigadier Ether's forces, which were still making their difficult way over the mountains. Despite this slowness on the left, Vassie didn't want to lose his impetus on the right, so on November 1st, he ordered Brigadier Lloyd to push on to Kobara. Meanwhile, the 25th Brigade was finally starting their advance on Kokoda with haste, with patrols from the 2nd 31st Battalion entering Kokoda to find no enemy opposition in the afternoon. Thus, by November 2nd, the Australians had firmly secured their control over the Kokoda and Kobara areas, regaining their airfield so that they could finally land supplies and enable all soldiers to fight on the front. The following day, as the Australians resupplied with airdrops, Vassie ordered Lloyd to advance towards Wairupi and defeat the Japanese at the Oivi-Garari area. Yet after passing Pirivi, the Australians would be met with a rain of fire coming from Oivi, where General Horii had constructed defensive bunkers above the high ground. From there, Colonel Yazawa's 41st Regiment would successfully pin down the enemy, forcing the Australians to halt and retreat for the day. Additionally, Horii had deployed Colonel Tsukamoto's forces around Garari, with the Kawada Battalion holding Waju to provide a defensive perimeter, and Tsukamoto's 1st Battalion in close support to Yazawa. On the morning of November 4th, the 2nd 2nd Battalion started to move forward again, suffering heavy machine gun fire and the shells of a mountain gun. The 2nd 3rd soon joined their frontal assault the following day, but not much progress could be made against the entrenched positions of the enemy. On October 26th, the Australians would even have to be reinforced with the 3rd Battalion, as heavy Japanese counterattacks left them holding thinly around their perimeter. But at this point, seeing that his frontal assaults were making little progress, Vasi decided to send the 25th Brigade on a flanking movement towards Gorari, where he would be joined by the 2nd 1st Battalion, which was already advancing from Kabara towards Elimo, and would have to retrace its steps back to Waju. Marching with haste, both forces would meet at Lini's Corner on the night of November 7th. Ether would then start his attack on Waju the following morning, achieving full surprise against the Kawada Battalion. Thus, Horii's forces were caught up in a pincer maneuver, with the 2nd Brigade applying pressure from the west, and the 25th Brigade attacking from the south. To counter this, the Kawada Battalion withdrew to Baribe, where it was to be reinforced by the 2nd Battalion. There, the 2nd 31st and 2nd 25th Battalions launched a two-pronged assault that put heavy pressure on the blocking force. At the same time, American aircraft began to bombard and strafe Yazawa's positions at Oivi, giving much-needed support to the battered 16th Brigade. Despite this, Lloyd had suffered almost 400 casualties since the start of the battle, so he couldn't achieve any breakthrough against the enemy. Yet the pressure was high, and this eventually forced Horii to order an evacuation towards the Kumusi River, which was further hampered by torrential rains. Additionally, Tsukamoto's battalion had to pull back towards Gorari to cover the Japanese evacuation, and Yazawa would have to start gradually thinning his defences in a piecemeal withdrawal. On the morning of November 9th, the 2nd 33rd and 2nd 1st Battalions finally joined the struggle, bypassing the surrounded Baribe positions and attacking directly against Horii's headquarters at Gorari. Coming from the west, Tsukamoto would manage to pin down and repel the 2nd 33rd, but still the 2nd 1st Battalion would successfully capture Horii's supply stores and the Lawuni Creek Bridge to the east. Horii's defensive strategy had turned into a disaster now, as all his forces had been cut off by the enemy. Without any other choice, Horii ordered a general withdrawal to the Kumusi that could only be done piecemeal because of the Australian infiltrations. On November 10th, Horii also had finally been pushed back out of Gorari, and in a desperate all-or-nothing move, he ordered his forces to rush the enemy positions with rifle and machine gun fire so as to open an avenue of escape. Even despite a devastating mountain gun barrage, the Japanese would fail to break through by November 11th, so they would have to cross the flood-swollen Oivi and Lawuni creeks and fight their way through to Papaki. By night, Yazawa's forces had successfully abandoned Oivi, only to find strong resistance around Gorari, so he would also decide to cross the Oivi Creek and make for the coast. And further south, Kawada's forces had failed to break through as well, then getting completely overrun by a major attack from both flanks, with few survivors managing to slip away towards Papaki. Meanwhile, units from the 2nd 31st and 2nd 1st Battalions would also cross the Lawuni, attacking the retreating Japanese soldiers from the rear, and successfully overrunning a 200-strong enemy rearguard. By November 14th, the remnants of Horii's elite South Seas detachment had crossed the Kumusi at Papaki and were now making their way to Garua, in preparation for their last defence of the Buna-Gona area. Concurrently, the Australians had reached the Kumusi around Wairopi on November 13th, finding there large stocks of abandoned artillery, equipment and supplies. Yet the Wairopi bridge had been destroyed, and it would not be until November 16th that Vasi's forces would manage to cross the river. After reuniting with Yazawa's forces on Pinga, Horii was anxious to get to Garua before the Allied attack on Buna started, and thus he decided to go down the remainder of the flooded Kumusi on a raft. Yet Horii's raft would soon get stuck on a submerged tree, and he would have to continue his journey on a canoe found nearby. Finally, the canoe would capsize under a fierce thunderstorm, and Horii would drown in the Kumusi because of his debilitation and prolonged hunger. Thus came the end of one of the most legendary generals of the Imperial Japanese Army, and thus came the end of the Kokoda Track campaign. Although the South Seas detachment had suffered more than 800 casualties, their last stand at Oivi-Garari would allow Japanese engineers to establish a strong defensive system around Buna-Gona and Sanananda that would give a lot of trouble to the Allied forces in the future. MacArthur's final counter-offensive was at last ready to be launched, and he wanted a quick victory before the Navy won at Guadalcanal, so he could indisputably command the drive to Tokyo. While the Australians continued to pursue the enemy back along the Kokoda Track, MacArthur and General Blamey had planned to make a secret wide envelopment to the east by flying American forces from Major General Edwin Harding's 32nd Division to strike at the enemy left flank in the vicinity of Buna. We'll recall that in October, the 2nd Battalion of the 126th Regiment had set off along the Jure Trail, yet they were extremely unprepared for the difficult trek over the Owen Stanley Range, suffering from diseases like malaria and dysentery. Additionally, the 128th Regiment had been flown to Wenigella by October 18th, and they would then board 20-ton motor launches to sail up the coast towards Pongani, where they halted to construct a landing strip on October 26th. Finally, the bulk of the 126th Regiment would be flown directly to Pongani's new strip by November 11th, arriving 9 days before its Ghost Battalion, which was in such bad condition that they had to be left in reserve for a week. Meanwhile, as the South Seas Detachment delayed the Australian advance on the Kokoda Track, Japanese engineers were building a network of defences in the Buna-Gona area, with hundreds of bunkers that were hard to spot, resistant to bullets, or that forced approaching troops to wade through swamps or cross open grassland to get to them. Additionally, they also built crawl trenches joining the bunkers, which allowed the defensive troops to move around the network and also served as lateral lines of covering fire. Furthermore, heavily camouflaged snipers were placed in treetops to pin down the enemy as they reached the coastal plain. In the absence of General Horii, whose fate was then unknown, command of the defense of Buna-Gona was under Colonel Yokoyama. He counted with the 3rd Battalion of the 41st Regiment at Garua, a group of SNLF Marines and engineers at Buna that totaled around 2,000 men, and an 800-strong road construction unit of Takasago volunteers at Gona, with a small detachment of the 41st Regiment. With few trained combat troops among them, Yokoyama knew that this was going to be a desperate defensive operation until reinforcements arrived, even going so far as to issue an edict that prohibited retreating. At this point, the 41st and 144th Regiments at the Kamusi River were still withdrawing from Garari through the Sanananda track, and they would set up new positions on the way to Garua. Additionally, Colonel Yazawa's 1st Battalion had continued on to the mouth of the Kamusi, so Yokoyama would have to send all available barges from Gona to bring them to Garua. Unfortunately, Allied planes attacked, and only 500 soldiers, including Yazawa himself, would reach Garua by November 29th, with the rest of the battalion being forced to continue on foot towards Gona. In pursuit of the retreating Japanese forces, the 7th Division of General Vasi had crossed the Kamusi River by November 16th, yet its 2 brigades would continue their advance on separate parallel tracks. Whereas Brigadier Lloyd's 16th Brigade would make for the sea at Sanananda Point. The 25th Brigade of Brigadier Ether would move forward on the left axis towards Gona. In the meantime, General Harding was planning to move north from Saputa in 2 columns. And because the Allies controlled Milne Bay and Goodenough Island, they were planning to supply this force mainly by sea, even though the Americans only counted with 7 luggers and a captured Japanese barge. On November 16th, the Americans thus began to move forward, and they also sent 3 luggers and their barge towards Oro Bay to unload rations, ammunition and men, including Harding himself. The heaviest weapons they could carry were light machine guns and mortars. Yet, unexpectedly, 14 Zeros fell upon them around Cape Sudest, destroying all 4 craft and forcing Harding and the survivors to swim ashore. With 2 more luggers getting destroyed the next morning, the American supply plan had been completely disrupted, forcing them to rely on airdrops until a new field at Dobudura could be constructed to afford air support for the surface transports. Despite this, by November 18th, the 128th Regiment had advanced up to Hariko and Simemi, and the bulk of the 126th Regiment had reached the vicinity of Inonda to protect the eastern flank of the Australians. Their mission was to retake Buna with speed, and luckily for them, their scouts reported that the garrison at Buna appeared to be very weak, and that their bunkers were nothing more than hasty field entrenchments. Thus, the Americans expected to end the campaign with one quick attack. Unfortunately for them, their reports were tremendously wrong, and it was one hell of a fight that was really awaiting them at Buna. By November 18th, meanwhile, the Japanese had also landed some 1,500 soldiers at Buna, including the 3rd Battalion of the 229th Regiment, which would be grouped under the command of Colonel Yamamoto Shigemi. Captain Yasuda Yoshihatsu immediately deployed them on his eastern flank, with his SNLF Marines protecting Buna village and the government station nearby, as he believed the enemy attack was likely to come from the sea. Yamamoto's line of defense thus ran through the Jurupa plantation to the airstrips and across the bridge between them, with outposts covering its approaches. In the meantime, the 25th Brigade had pushed across the tropical lowlands, with its men suffering from steaming heat, mud, fever, and sore feet. They would reach Jombora on November 18th, sending forward a small patrol to occupy Gona if no enemy presence was found, or alternatively to report their strength. The following day, the 60-man patrol met strong opposition as the Australians tried to advance through a large kunai patch just south of Gona. In response, Brigadier Ether sent the 2nd 31st Battalion in the afternoon to clear the way, yet the tenacious defenders at the kunai clearings soon forced them to dig in a semicircle before Gona. But as the night advanced, the 2nd 31st started to suffer heavy casualties, even losing 4 of its company commanders, something that eventually forced Ether to order their withdrawal. Under the cover of darkness, the Australians would successfully pull back behind the Amboga crossing, yet the activeness of the enemy defenders showed them that Gona would be harder to take than they thought. Thus, Ether would decide to wait for supplies on November 20th, with supply aircraft finally appearing the following day. With his forces now well fed and equipped, the 2nd 31st and 2nd 33rd Battalions were earmarked to launch a second attack for November 22nd. Meanwhile, the tired and hungry men of the 6th Brigade slowly marched through deep creeks and dense forests. Their advance was further hampered by heavy rains that flooded the creeks and made their crossings very hazardous, with many of their soldiers falling down gasping beside the track even before they engaged the enemy. By November 18th, however, they had reached Popondetta, with promises that supplies would be awaiting them at Saputa. At the same time, the 126th Regiment found that it couldn't establish radio contact with Vassi's forces, so the Americans decided to send a detachment towards Saputa to prevent a surprise enemy counterattack through there. Early on November 19th, they would find that Brigadier Lloyd's forces were past Popondetta, so the Americans would continue their advance towards Horanda. Scarcely had they reached Horanda that the 126th was informed that it had been put under Vassi's command, and that it needed to march to Saputa to reinforce the 16th Brigade. On this day, the Australians also began to encounter the first enemy elements waiting for them in the bushes. Despite this, the 2nd 3rd Battalion would reach Saputa by nightfall, finally encountering some much-needed supplies. The following morning, Lloyd's men would continue to press ahead to Sanananda to cut the coastal track that led to Buna. Yet the 2nd 1st Battalion would soon enter into an open kunai patch where Colonel Tsukamoto's South Seas Detachment was waiting in ambush. Rapid volleys and effective artillery fire then started to fall on them, quickly scattering the Australians and forcing them to slow their advance. But no matter what the enemy might do, the relentless Australians continued to push on, as 2 small detachments were sent to flank the Japanese positions and force them to retreat. Although the right flank unit rapidly smashed the Japanese left flank, inflicting heavy casualties on the Kawada Battalion and killing Colonel Kawada, the Australians would be held against their main positions as the defenders tenaciously resisted their assaults. By late afternoon, as the first American element started to reach Saputa, the vicious fighting finally forced Lloyd to send the 2nd 3rd and 2nd Battalions to reinforce the positions of the 2nd 1st and its right flank unit. But during the night, the 90 men of the left-wing unit, under the command of Captain Basil Caterns, were finally approaching the main track and would then stealthily infiltrate the Japanese positions through the silent bushes, successfully getting to 50 yards off the enemy line before the Japanese began to unleash their firepower upon them. Yet the Australians fiercely resisted the enemy attacks, hurling forward straight for the centre of the main defensive position at a great cost in lives. At last he managed to dig in on a small salient in the main Japanese line, thus severely threatening the defenders' positions. With daybreak on November 21st, Khaturs would have to desperately resist many strong counterattacks by the tenacious Japanese, while the 2nd, 2nd and 2nd, 3rd Battalion pressed forward to relieve the Australian pocket. By nightfall, Khaturs' manoeuvre had effectively forced the main Japanese force to withdraw, with the 2nd, 3rd taking position on his rear to relieve them by midnight. And further east, on November 19th, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 128th Regiment started to move north under torrential rain to strike at the Japanese eastern flank. Yet their advance would soon be stopped by intense rifle and automatic fire around the new strip. The American National Servicemen paid dearly for their inexperience, as their leading units lost contact with one another and even with themselves during their advance through the jungles and swamps. Whereas the 1st Battalion was bewildered by the impression that the enemy surrounded them, the 3rd Battalion came under such intense fire on the wooden causeway of the Samemi Creek that it was forced to a halt. General Harding counted with a detachment of the 1st Battalion 126th Regiment and the 2nd 6th Independent Company as direct reserves for the coastal advance, while the 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment was at Dobadura in reserve for the 3rd Battalion's attack. He also planned to employ the 126th Regiment to engage the western flank of the Buna position, yet their redeployment to the Sanananda front ruined his plans and forced him to appoint his 2nd Battalion to command the western assault. As the forces on the front were getting pinned down by well-camouflaged Japanese machine gun posts that couldn't even be spotted by the Americans, Harding had no other choice but to stop the attack. This would give him time to divide his forces into 2 task forces, with the Urbana Force preparing for the western attack and the Warren Force of Brigadier General Hanford McNider launching its 2nd assault on the east the following day. This time, with the aid of aircraft and with minimum artillery support, the 1st Battalion would manage to push about 100 yards, yet the 3rd Battalion would again fail to advance past the bridge. But this is it for this week. The Allies had been naively expecting a quick victory at Buna-Gona, but instead they would have to endure a devastatingly drawn-out affair thanks to the effective efforts of the Japanese defenders. After the 2 unsuccessful attacks on November 19th and 20th, a frustrated MacArthur, who had arrived at Port Moresby back on November 6th, ordered the storming of Buna's defences. This time, Warren Force was going to launch a 3-pronged assault along the coast against the eastern end of the new strip, while Urbana Force was to simultaneously push from Ango towards Garua. Yet in the confusion, the Allies would fail to take advantage of the morning air bombardment of the Japanese positions, launching their assault about an hour after the aircraft had finished their task. Furthermore, the bombers' attack would also hit the positions of the 3rd Battalion 128th Regiment, which would suffer huge damage to its morale because of this, and would thus be unable to advance past the bridge. In the end, the assault of Warren Force would be a fiasco, with the 1st Battalion 128th Regiment scarcely improving its position. Only the Australian commandos of the 2nd 6th Independent Company would be successful, clearing several machine gun posts and shooting down many snipers from trees before they had to withdraw because the Americans had failed to support them. With another defeat culminated on November 21st, MacArthur was apoplectic, again issuing an order to storm Buna's defences, but it would be to no avail thanks to the tenacious defence of the Japanese soldiers. Yet at least they had some good news, as the Dobadura airfield had been completed with great speed, and the forces could now be adequately supplied. At the same time, the 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment had reached a fork on the track to Garua, an area that would be known as the Triangle. Here, the Americans would be ambushed by the enemy and would have to plunge deep into the swamps to escape annihilation. Knowing that only 1 battalion would be insufficient to gain success in the west, General Harding then managed to convince General Vassie to send the 2nd Battalion 126th Regiment to reinforce Urbana Force. The following day, Harding started to readjust his coastal positions, with the 3rd Battalion being ordered to join the other forces on the seashore, since it had made almost no progress in 3 days. There, Colonel Alexander McNabb unofficially assumed command of Warren Force on November 23rd, after General McNider was seriously wounded, immediately attempting to infiltrate the enemy positions under the cover of artillery fire. Lack of observation, however, rendered the artillery assault ineffective, and as a result, McNabb's forces would again only get to advance 100 yards. In the meantime, a Buna force was also marching to launch a second attack on the triangle, yet their advance through the swamps would be slow and difficult, as their supply line was neck-deep in mud and water. Furthermore, their mortar shells got wet and failed, and machine guns and other weapons became clogged with swamp muck and jammed. Nonetheless, Harding ordered them to attack on the morning of November 21st, after an airstrike over the triangle was conducted. Only 12 fighters would be sent though, and they would strafe a Buna force headquarters instead of the Japanese positions. Under artillery support, the relentless Americans then pressed on with a three-pronged attack, quickly running into strong opposition. While the frontal assault was stopped by strong barbed wire defences, the right wing would be held on the slopes of the Kunai Strip as concentrated fire fell upon them, eventually forcing them to fall back into the swamps. Lastly, the left wing would encircle around Entrance Creek, yet accurate and heavy fire would also force them to dig holes and lay in them with swamp water seeping over them. Captain Yasuda then ordered his SNLF Marines to counterattack, quickly driving the Americans out of their foxholes and back into the swamps. As the men were hungry, exhausted and incapable of further effort, a Buna force would start to retreat on November 25th, though they would at last learn that the enemy forces on the right were too strong and that it would be better to concentrate on the left flank. Thus a new plan would be drafted to bypass the triangle completely and outflank the Japanese defences by getting the men onto a grassy strip which bestrode the left fork of the track. Additionally, Colonel John Mott would officially assume command of a Buna force for a scheduled November 30th attack. Meanwhile, a new assault by Warren Force was ready to launch on November 26th, as they had received some artillery reinforcements in the past days. The attack was preceded by a large air operation that included many P-40s and Beaufighters to strafe the enemy positions, and A-20s to bomb their rear, as well as half an hour of artillery bombardment. Then at 09:30, the 3rd Battalion advanced on the right towards Cape Ndiaye, while the 1st Battalion 126th Regiment was to move northwest towards Strip Point, but unknowingly was marching east and thus opened a gap in the left flank. The air and artillery bombardment had again failed to suppress the strong Japanese bunkers, so the Japanese would easily be able to stop the American advance, as their own aircraft rushed from Lae to further strafe the enemy positions. Furthermore, the wasted manoeuvring of the 1st Battalion left the Australian commandos right out on a limb as they tried to seal the left flank. This prevented them from crossing into the new strip, so yet again another attack by Warren Force would end in failure. As McNab's forces made no progress in the next few days, Harding planned to launch his next assault on November 30th alongside a Buna force's offensive. But now we move to Gona, where Brigadier Ether was planning to launch another attack on November 22nd. The 2nd 33rd Battalion had already moved in to within 2 miles of Gona, and early in the morning it would commence its advance along the track. Yet the Japanese would quickly step forward to stop their advance, thus inflicting heavy casualties on the Australians. In response, Ether sent the 2nd 31st Battalion around the right of the 2nd 33rd to come against Gona from the east. After traversing through the swamps, the Australians would break cover to enter into a narrow frontage on the Kunai Patch, where they would be instantly met with intense fire from the front and right flank. Yelling as they advanced, some soldiers managed to reach the Japanese pits, but were then cut down as the enemy enfiladed them from both sides. With the 2nd 31st retreating behind the 2nd 33rd, and the attack completely stopped, Ether then sent the 2nd 25th Battalion to attack the enemy from the east on November 23rd, yet they would again be easily repelled by the fierce Japanese defenders after only gaining little ground. Though each battalion had been reinforced with a company of the 21st Brigade's Cha Force, Ether's forces had been badly mauled during the attack. Thus he would bring forward the 3rd Battalion to launch another assault, this time from the southwest across Gona Creek. After conducting a heavy air bombardment on November 24th, the 3rd Battalion stepped forward the following morning under mortar and artillery support, initially penetrating the enemy defences to a depth of 50 yards, but then getting stopped by the strong fortifications of the Japanese. Nonetheless, they would withdraw only with light casualties, though on November 26th, the Japanese would launch a strong counterattack against the 2nd 33rd that further inflicted more losses. At this point, the 4 battalions of the 25th Brigade totaled just over the strength of a single battalion, so Ether knew that he needed reinforcements fast. Luckily for him, General Vassie was sending forward the 21st Brigade of Brigadier Ivan Doherty to support the attack on Gona, and it was scheduled to arrive on November 30th to join the next attack against the enemy. Meanwhile, we left Brigadier Lloyd's forces in a grueling struggle with Colonel Tsukamoto's South Seas detachment at the Sanananda Track. As night came on November 21st, the leading companies of the 2nd 3rd Battalion were in the process of relieving Captain Catterns's battered detachment, which had made a small salient in the main Japanese line. The Australians would decide to vacate this area and to settle just in its rear though, thinking that holding that position was not prudent, although time would tell that the small salient would have made future operations easier. Of Catterns's original 91 men, only 24 remained unscathed, with 31 dead and 36 wounded. Furthermore, the whole 16th Brigade had lost 1/3 of its original strength, so they needed to be reinforced by the 126th Regiment urgently. By November 22nd, its 3rd Battalion had arrived into the 16th Brigade area to press along the track beyond the Australian positions, also sending 2 companies to envelop the main Japanese line. Lloyd's men were content to sit back for a while and watch the Americans, who to their amusement said that the Australians could go home now, as they were here to clean things up. Yet the American advance would be confusing and slow, so they would have to postpone their attack for several days. In the meantime, a composite company of the 2nd 3rd Battalion had also been sent to break bush around the left flank, until they cut a track to Cape Killerton in an effort to support the future thrust of the 21st Brigade. Lloyd's patrol would reach the Killerton track on November 28th, only to find that swamps blocked his eastward move. Anxious due to the American delay, General Vassie then ordered him to send more patrols there in an effort to find a way to cut the Sanananda track, though their reports would confirm that no large body of troops could do this. Finally, on November 26th, the American attack started as Companies I and K moved forward behind an intense mortar and artillery barrage, though Companies C, D and L would easily be held by the Japanese machine gun fire in a series of indecisive skirmishes, with a particularly savage struggle occurring on the right flank. The left wing would struggle with the bush and with vigorous feelers from the Japanese right in the following days, yet their main effort would be scheduled to start on November 30th. As a final note, we want to mention that on the night of November 26th, there was an unexpected clash between American military police and Australian troops outside the American Post Exchange in Brisbane, in the course of which an American military policeman fired several shots, wounding 8 Australians and killing 1. Next evening, the Australians retaliated, as 4 or 5 small groups roamed the streets of Brisbane to attack military police, resulting in 21 Americans getting injured. This was a dark turn for the collaboration between the two countries, but Major General Frank Berryman would immediately take steps to combat ill feelings between the two forces, something that would further improve the already cordial relationship between the American and Australian soldiers. Back on November 24th, the Japanese had landed an infantry unit of 80 soldiers that would be immediately deployed at the southern end of the mission to repel the Australian attacks. In the meantime, General Adachi had placed Major General Yamagata Suyuo of the 21st Independent Mixed Brigade in charge of the Buna detachment, which encompassed all units in Buna-Gona that were not under the South Seas detachment. Yamagata would depart Rabaul on the early hours of November 29th with the first echelon of his command, but Allied bombers would intercept his 4 destroyers, proceeding without air cover in the Vitiaz Strait, forcing them to turn back and preventing the reinforcement of Gona. At the same time, Brigadier Ether was also increasing his numbers, as the 21st Brigade of Brigadier Doherty, the same that had previously been relieved by the 25th Brigade at Iori Baiwa, started to arrive at the battlefront. On November 28th, the 2nd 14th Battalion was the first to reach Ether's position, although it would immediately continue further north and then northeast through a long stretch of kunai to strike at Gona from the east. Yet as they moved to their assembly area, they ran into strong opposition at the village of Banumi, which was held by Japanese laborers. Despite their well-positioned and well-defended firing posts, the inexperienced labourers would be easily overrun as a deadly mortar barrage devastated their lines. Nonetheless, they would manage to cling to the village by nightfall, though the defenders were losing heart and they were completely surrounded by the enemy. As the 2nd 14th concentrated on clearing Banumi, Doherty instead deployed the 2nd 27th Battalion on the western bank of Small Creek to launch the attack against Gona from the east. Next morning, the 2nd 14th would attack again after another deadly mortar barrage. Valiantly resisting for an entire day against a superior and battle-hardened force, the Japanese would finally break and run by November 30th, some desperately swimming into the sea where they were easily picked off, and some successfully escaping into the jungles. To the west, the 3rd and 2nd 33rd Battalion also launched simultaneous attacks to soften the main Japanese defences, but their advance quickly came under enfiladed fire that forced them to withdraw. Meanwhile, Ether had also deployed the 2nd 16th Chaforce Company of Lieutenant Alan Haddy on the west bank of Gona Creek since November 21st, so the Japanese were completely besieged. As the defenders were isolated and lacked communications with Garua, Major Koiwai was instructed to stage a rescue by sea of the forces at Gona by November 30th. Departing Sanananda during the night with 2 companies of his battalion, Koiwai would reach the Gona beaches after midnight, but failed to identify his compatriots' positions and eventually had to withdraw under Australian fire. That same morning, the 2nd 27th attack would start after a heavy aerial bombardment that inflicted many losses on the defenders. Yet the Australians were slow to advance after the raids, and by the time they did, the defenders were ready for them. The 2nd 27th would only manage to take a couple of footholds over the beach before machine gun fire from concealed bunkers and sniper fire brought them to a halt. Additionally, Lieutenant Haddy had managed to take control of Kikori village and then continued further west to the village of Napapo, where they had successfully repelled the vanguard of the 1st Battalion of the 41st Regiment, which had been marching from the mouth of the Kamusi and was now starting to reach Gona. Thus, from this point onwards, this village would be known as Haddy's Village. On December 1st, the 2nd 27th resumed its attack under smoke cover with bayonets fixed, initially infiltrating the centre of the enemy line, but suffering heavy casualties against the tenacious defenders, who finally forced them to retreat across Gona Creek. During the night, Yamagata's 2nd Echelon also finally arrived at Basabua, as the enemy B-17s were successfully intercepted by Zeros, though further air attacks would force them to relocate to the mouth of the Kamusi River, so they would have to push down the shoreline towards Gona after landing. Over the next couple of days, the tide slowly started to turn against the worn-out defenders, as many diseases such as diarrhea and malaria devastated the Japanese, who couldn't even go far from their bunkers because of the strong artillery and mortar shelling. Most of the Australian charges were successfully repelled at a high cost for the attackers, but occasionally a post would be overrun, so the defensive line started to gradually whittle away until the Japanese were squeezed into a small area by December 5th. Now, however, we have to move to the Sanananda front, where the American attack to cut off Colonel Sugimoto's forces was reaching its climax. Reinforced by anti-tank and cannon companies on November 29th, and placed under the command of Major Bernd Bethke, the left wing commenced its assault the following morning, initially gaining ground against the fierce defenders. Yet the staunch Japanese fortifications would soon slow them down, and it wouldn't be until Captain John Shirley led his Company I in a deadly bayonet charge that the enemy defences would be finally pierced. Shirley's men then set up a perimeter defence astride the track, just south of the Cape Killerton junction, thus dividing the Japanese defences into 2 main positions. The rest of the Bethke detachment, meanwhile, was still in the bush 1,400 yards west of the roadblock, and they couldn't move in lest their supply line would be put at high risk. Because of this, Captain Meredith Huggins was sent with a ration party to move supplies into the roadblock, eventually getting through after a particularly hard fight. On December 1st, the Japanese immediately started to launch their first wave of constant counterattacks, which would manage to hold Shirley's men in check for the foreseeable future. As the Americans had dug in on a fairly open space in the midst of a swampy jungle surrounded by tall trees, vulnerable to sniping and surprise attacks, the roadblock perimeter would be easily reduced, killing Shirley in the process. Huggins then took command of the forces there, thus giving that position the name of Huggins's roadblock. In the following days, the Japanese would continue to repeatedly attack the roadblock, while at the same time pushing back all attempts to break through their lines, gradually wearing down Huggins's men and placing their position at high risk. After 9 days of marching and fighting, the 126th Regiment had finally achieved the same result Captain Caterns had carried out in a day with 1/3 of the American strength, but this was to serve as valuable experience for the US national servicemen. And moving on to Buna, General Harding was about to launch another offensive on November 30th, supported by the closely integrated artillery of Major General Albert Waldron. At 06:30, Warren Force finally commenced its attack, but yet again they would suffer a storm of well-directed fire that would force the Americans to the ground. As Warren Force had thus stunned itself once more against the Japanese defences, a Buna force had been marching through the darkness and swamps to a point above the triangle since 0400. Colonel Mott's advance had mixed results, with 2 companies quickly pushing through to the southeastern edge of the objective, 2 companies getting lost in the swamps or failing to get through the Japanese fortifications, and 1 company successfully skirting the enemy defences to get to Horii village. The American forces of the 32nd Division were having a hard time against the camouflaged and solidly entrenched Japanese fortifications, as both the Warren and Urbana forces struggled to break through the enemy defences. Despite the increase in artillery power, General Harding knew that his men needed the kind of support that tanks could provide if they wanted to prevail, but none would appear this early on in the battle. At Milne Bay, General Clowes had actually been reinforced with the 2nd 6th Armoured Regiment in early November, so efforts had been made to send a squadron of Stuart tanks towards Oro Bay. Yet the available seacraft there were unable to transport such weight, and instead, Clowes would ultimately be forced to send a platoon of Bren carriers by November 22nd. In the meantime, American losses would amount to 492 men, without any sort of meaningful gain to show for it. This, coupled with Australian reports of the bad performance of American infantry and the abysmal impression that Harding had left on General Herring, left General MacArthur in the grip of a great disquiet at Port Moresby. Thus he immediately summoned General Eichelberger and sent him to the front to inspect Harding's progress. Upon arrival on December 1st, Eichelberger found both Warren and Urbana forces trying themselves once more against the enemy defences. As usual, Colonel McNabb's forces would be held on the water's edge, though this time 2 companies would be sent to circle the southern edge of the new strip to reinforce the position at the Samemi Creek Bridge. Meanwhile, Colonel Mott attempted a flanking attack on Buna village with strong artillery support, but just as the impetus was mounting, the leading company unexpectedly pulled back, so the attack would quickly falter. As Eichelberger was not impressed by this performance, he would decide to personally accompany Generals Harding and Waldron to the Urbana front to observe the December 2nd attack, while 2 of his trusted staff officers were sent to do the same with Warren Force. McNabb's plan was to launch a feint towards Cape Ndiaidere after a strong air bombardment, while the bulk of the coastal forces probed the eastern end of New Strip, and those forces at the bridge attacked north and northwest. Yet the attack ended up being completely anticlimactic, as the Allied aircraft launched an effective air bombardment but failed to signal the conclusion of their runs to the ground forces, so the Americans could not take advantage of this, nor did the Japanese fall for their feint. Intense and skillful fire would ultimately erase the Americans' intentions in their early stages, and the deplorable state of the soldiers would be reported by Eichelberger's staff. A similar lack of success marked the Urbana force attack that day, with Eichelberger noting that the front line was weak, the men hungry, and the leadership uninspiring. Thus, he decided to relieve Harding of his command, placing the 32nd Division under the control of General Waldron. Just as MacArthur expected, Eichelberger then shuffled his colonels and majors, with Colonel John Groves taking command of the Urbana force, and Colonel Clarence Martin doing the same with Warren Force. Eichelberger would further give 2 days of respite for both forces to reorganize, scheduling another frontal assault with air and artillery support for December 5th. During this time, Martin decided to place the 1st Battalion, 126th Regiment, south of the bridge, while the 3rd Battalion 128th Regiment relieved the 1st Battalion 128th Regiment on the coast, and to the west, Groves placed the 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment on the right, and the 2nd Battalion 126th Regiment on his left. Spearheaded by 5 Bren carriers that landed on November 29th, Warren Force started its renewed assault on the morning of December 5th. Yet the carriers had originally been designed for reconnaissance and the rapid transport of troops across bullet-swept ground, not for tank duties. Under heavy Japanese fire, the carriers' underbellies would be caught on stumps in the uneven ground, the vehicles rising in the air and becoming easy targets. Hand grenades were thrown into the carriers, and adhesion mines attached to their sides by roaming Japanese, with anti-tank guns also firing at them. Within 20 minutes, the 5 Bren carriers lay abandoned, proof of the dictum that carriers were not tanks. Thus, the American attack would again falter against the deeply entrenched enemy positions. On the Abana front, however, after 9 Kitty Hawks strafed the government station to prevent any Japanese reinforcement, Groves decided to launch a 4-pronged attack against Buna village. Although his flank companies would fail to make any meaningful progress against the SNLF Marines, Company E got within 50 yards of the village before it was stopped, and a platoon of Company G, under the command of the German Staff Sergeant Hermann Böttcher, took quick advantage of an opening to overcome a number of enemy positions, and halted only when they reached the sea. There, with 18 men and 1 machine gun, Böttcher dug in on a narrow sand spit just east of the village, virtually commanding the line between the government station in the east and the village in the west. Additionally, the 128th Regiment would successfully gain control of Entrance Creek, except for the area of the Coconut Grove, which was still strongly held. Though these were small gains, this is effectively considered as one of the major turning points of the battle, as Buna village was now completely cut off from landward help, and it would only be a matter of time for Captain Yasuda's stronghold to fall. An important aspect of the American success was that Eichelberger and his staff moved to the front lines and exhorted the men to charge the enemy bunkers. Although they regularly came under fire, Eichelberger insisted on being present with his forward troops to restore their flagging confidence. Because of this, Waltran would be injured on December 5th, getting replaced by Brigadier General Clovis Byers in command of the 32nd Division. On the Japanese side, with casualties mounting and promised reinforcements failing to arrive, morale was starting to slip, and food was in short supply. In the next couple of days, because the swamps and bush had drained the physical strength of his men, Eichelberger decided to issue a policy of continued pressure and advance by infiltration, as a preliminary to the successive reduction of Buna village, the Coconut Grove, and the Triangle. In the meantime, the tenacious Böttcher would have to single-handedly repel wave after wave of Japanese counterattacks to maintain his corner position, and on December 7th, Colonel Clarence Tomlinson would take command of Maroubra Force, as Gross was assigned to command the 127th Regiment, which was earmarked to reinforce the Americans shortly. By December 11th, the 3rd Battalion, 127th Regiment had successfully relieved the battered 2nd Battalion, 126th Regiment on the Abana front. On the Warren front, meanwhile, Eichelberger had decided against any more frontal assaults for the moment, instead concentrating on pinching off individual posts. He would wait for tanks and fresh Australian troops to be brought from Milne Bay before resuming his attack with Warren Force, as General Blamey had already prepared the 18th Brigade to reinforce the American assault because he felt very disappointed by their combat performance. During this time, Yasuda's fierce defenders continued to hold their position in the face of onslaught, with groups of mortars firing at them simultaneously in an improvised hammer bombing. Yet their position would finally become untenable by December 13th, and Yasuda would at last evacuate the village with his remaining 100 men along the coast to Garua. On the morning of December 14th, Eichelberger would renew his attack on Buna with the 127th Regiment reinforcements, but they would find the village empty as they entered. Thus came the fall of Buna village. Moving to the Gona area, we've already seen how the Japanese positions got completely encircled by the forces of Brigadiers Ether and Doherty, who now started to gradually squeeze the enemy perimeter at a high cost for both sides. With casualties mounting up, General Vasi was considering containing the area while the bulk of his forces moved east to concentrate on Sanananda. In that regard, on December 2nd, the 2nd 14th Battalion was ordered east along the coastal track in a flanking threat to Sanananda, though the difficult mangrove swamps would block their advance beyond Basabur. More reinforcements were also starting to arrive, as the 30th Brigade of Brigadier Porter was earmarked to relieve Ether's spent units, and the 39th Battalion of Colonel Honor was sent to reinforce the eastward attack. Doherty was placed under command of this force, but he would soon find that no line of approach could be established through the difficult country on December 3rd, thus forcing Vasi to cancel his plan. Instead, he pushed forward the relief of Ether's 25th Brigade, though the 30th Brigade would instead be sent to fight in the Sanananda front, and only the 39th Battalion would remain under Doherty's command. At this point, however, the Australians were alerted about General Yamagata's dispersed landing along the coast between Kamusi and the Amboga, so Doherty would decide to launch a renewed assault on December 6th after a pre-dawn mortar barrage. Yet the smoke made it difficult to locate hidden machine gun posts, and the crossing lines of fire ensured no significant penetration by the 39th Battalion, while the attack along the coast would once again bog down against the Japanese heavy fire. Meanwhile, to the west at Hadi's village, the unit of Lieutenant Hadi had been reduced to 20 volunteers, all racked with fever and feeling weak. By the night of December 6th, Yamagata's dispersed forces had reunited with the survivors of the 1st Battalion, 41st Regiment, totaling some 280 men. Just before a rain-driven midnight, the Japanese started their attack, rapidly overwhelming the defenders. Yet Hadi's men would soon be reinforced with the bulk of the 2nd 14th Battalion, and in a violent clash, both forces would suffer heavy casualties. Nonetheless, the Japanese started to encircle them by afternoon, and the defenders would be forced to pull back 500 yards, with Lieutenant Hadi dying at the hands of the enemy while fiercely covering the withdrawal. Nonetheless, Yamagata would be ultimately prevented by the 2nd 14th Battalion from breaking through to reinforce the Gonabuna defenders. The latter now knew that a major attack was imminent, and that the end of their brave stand was near, inevitable, and irresistible. The non-combatant Tasago volunteers had successfully held off a superior enemy force for nearly 3 weeks, inflicting heavy casualties on the Australians, but their end was nigh. On the morning of December 8th, Doherty was planning to conduct his last throw against the enemy, as his fighting strength was down to 792 men, less than a full-strength battalion. As usual, the defenders had to endure a heavy mortar and artillery barrage, waiting for it to end so they could set up again their machine gun posts and repel the expected infantry advance. But 2 minutes before the scheduled end of shelling, the 39th Battalion started its attack and rapidly smashed the Japanese positions from the south and southeast. As the attackers were up at the Japanese line before the shelling stopped, machine gun posts were rushed while the occupants were still setting up, and defenders were subjected to grenade and Bren gun fire while they were sheltering from the bombardment. Though the beachside attack was contained, several posts on the opposite perimeter fell immediately, and the breach provided an opening for more Australian troops to push in towards the centre. By night, the Japanese had lost control of half their perimeter and the centre of their defences, and in their desperation, the defenders tried to escape towards Sanananda through the Australian lines or by taking to the water and swimming to the open sea. Most of them would be cut down by Bren gunfire, with only a handful of experienced Tasago volunteers resourcefully breaking through towards Garua. By December 9th, the Australians would finally clean out the remaining pockets of resistance, and Doherty would receive the long-sought and laconic message, "Gona's gone." Yet with the fall of Gona, they now had to deal with the new threat that emerged to the west, General Yamagata's fresh reinforcements. But now we have to head to the Sanananda front, where the American forces continued to resist in the Huggins roadblock. As Captain Huggins successfully held off the Japanese counterattacks, Vasi again planned to conduct a renewed assault on December 5th. Yet the frontal attack would soon go to ground after only 100 yards, and the Beitka detachment would be decimated as it swung eastwards. The Japanese then continued to attack the Huggins roadblock, badly wounding its captain and blocking off all attempts to supply the besieged Americans. As their situation was urgent, Vassie quickly directed Porter's 30th Brigade to relieve the worn 16th Brigade on December 6th. The following day, Porter was planning to clear the Japanese from the area south of the roadblock with an attack by his two fresh, albeit poorly trained battalions. After the typical artillery barrage, the militia 49th Battalion advanced through the bushes without detailed briefing or preliminary reconnaissance, and with signal cable that was shorter than the distance to the Japanese line, so they would have to use runners to communicate with its command. Soon they would be met with a wall of enfilading machine gun fire in thick jungle and scrub, and although they would successfully overrun a number of Japanese positions and link up with the 2nd Battalion's men, the 49th would disastrously suffer 229 casualties, 48% of the battalion's strength. Porter then sent forward the amalgamated 55th 53rd Battalion on the left, but its attack would also end in disaster, resulting in a further 130 casualties for little gain. The immediate effect of these huge losses was that a period of comparative pause and further preparation would develop for about 12 days, with the Australian command retreating to a policy of constant patrols to probe the enemy positions. As a final note, on December 8th, supplies would finally get through to the roadblock, and Huggins would be successfully evacuated, with Lieutenant Peter Del Ponte assuming command of the forces. Del Ponte would be resupplied again on December 10th, while he continues to resist the enemy counterattacks, but no more supplies would reach him until December 14th, with the Americans almost out of ammunition but still holding the roadblock. With the fall of Gona on December 9th, the forces of Brigadier Doherty now turned west to deal with the fresh troops that had landed with General Yamagata. At this point, the 21st Brigade had lost a total of 409 men, and the 39th Battalion had additionally suffered 121 losses, almost 41% of Doherty's strength, so the Australians would decide to advance with caution against Yamagata. During these days, from positions halfway between Gona and Hadi's village, the debilitated 2nd 14th Battalion would skirmish with the enemy along the coast, while the 39th Battalion moved in to reinforce them. On December 11th, the Australians would also launch a surprise attack across the swamps on the far side of the Japanese line, and although their charge would be eventually halted, several enemy outposts would fall to them and many casualties would be inflicted. A Japanese overnight counterattack managed to recover some of the posts, so Yamagata resolved to secure his current position in the Gona area, wait for the arrival of the 2nd echelon of reinforcements, and plan subsequent strategies. Another attempt at landing the original echelon of the 170th Regiment had actually been carried out on December 8th, but yet again, unchallenged American bombers would force them to withdraw after damaging 3 Japanese destroyers. In the next few days, the 2nd 14th would gradually push the Japanese into their main defences at Hadi's village through some small actions and costly skirmishes, and on December 15th, the 39th would finally arrive at the front, slowly closing in from the west and surrounding Yamagata's men. The following day, as the 2nd 14th was placed under Honor's command, the Australians decided to launch a coordinated assault, successfully capturing some huts on the southeast corner of the village and inflicting many casualties on the enemy. On December 17th, the attackers drew their ring closer still to the Japanese main defences, using a grenade launcher to outright destroy the enemy bunkers. Yet by nightfall, Yamagata would complete his evacuation of Hadi's village, as he had been orderly evacuating his wounded and supplies since the start of the engagement, only leaving behind a couple of men in hiding and successfully withdrawing to Danewetu. At dawn on December 18th, the Australians then finally swarmed through the village, rapidly overrunning the remaining pockets of resistance as they found little opposition. Now Yamagata knew that he wasn't strong enough to fight his way to Buna through the Australian lines, and as he was under frequent air attack and with the enemy pressing hard, he definitely had to wait until more reinforcements could arrive, which were coming in shortly. On December 14th, the original echelon of the 170th Regiment would finally arrive at the mouth of the Mambari River, covered by bad weather as the poor visibility prevented Allied air attacks. With the soldiers would also come Major General Oda Kensaku, who had been appointed by General Adachi to replace the legendary General Horii as commander of the South Seas Detachment. Upon landing, the Japanese got their supplies and barges safely under the cover of the shoreline vegetation. But unbeknownst to them, coast watchers from the Papuan Infantry Battalion would spot them and alert headquarters. Allied aircraft then bombed their supply dumps and constantly harassed the freshly landed troops, forcing them to move by night and delaying Oda's advance to the Amboga River. Oda and Yamagata would finally meet at Vanuatu on December 18th, and they would learn of new orders for the landed forces to move to Garua and take charge of the fighting along the Sanananda track. 3 days later, Oda would sail by barge to Garua, where he officially took over command from Colonel Yokoyama. Yamagata, however, remained at Vanuatu with his men, resisting the enemy attacks for a few days while he prepared the evacuation of his detachment. On December 26th, the Japanese would finally escape the Gona area and would sail by barge to Garua, thus concluding the Gona front and giving the spent men of the 21st Brigade some well-earned resting time. Moving on to the Buna area, we've left a victorious Maroubra force occupying Buna village and preparing to subjugate the government station. But another threat still remained at the Triangle and the Coconut Grove, and trying to exploit the physical uplift which followed the capture of the village, General Eichelberger immediately set out to clear these areas. This task was assigned to the scattered 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment, with Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Smith taking a small band of 84 men to attack Coconut Grove on December 16th. Fire swept them in their approach, wounding General Byers among others, but Smith tenaciously continued forward, successfully holding his position during the night under a drenching rain. The next morning, the American attack began, with 3 separate groups coming out of the trees and rapidly overwhelming the Japanese positions. By noon, the grove was in Smith's hands, and with it stocks of food, weapons and ammunition. From there, the Americans would at once cross Entrance Creek to establish themselves firmly on the eastern bank before they were checked. Smith then sent his men against the Triangle on December 19th, but the defenders fiercely resisted their attacks and inflicted many casualties on the Americans. With Byers wounded, Eichelberger had officially assumed command of the 32nd Division, knowing that if he wanted to launch his attack on the government station, he first needed to take care of the 2 threats on his flanks, the Japanese strongholds at the Triangle and Mesita Island. For these tasks, Colonel Tomlinson now received the reinforcement of the 127th Regiment, with its 2nd Battalion immediately relieving the battered 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment, and its 3rd Battalion doing the same with the 2nd Battalion 126th Regiment. On December 18th, the 3rd Battalion had first gone into action as it crossed into Mesita unopposed, but eventually it would be driven back in disorder by strong Japanese fire. The following day, Tomlinson also sent his battalion to attack the Triangle after a heavy air bombardment, but the defenders inflicted many casualties on the Americans as they attempted to cross the bridge. As another attempt to clear out the Triangle on December 20th failed yet again, and no progress had been made in 3 days, Tomlinson would be replaced by Colonel Gross as commander of Maroubra Force. Eichelberger and Gross now had decided to bypass and isolate the Triangle, secure Mesita Island as a staging point for an assault on the mission, and directly attack the northwest end of the government gardens. By December 15th, a battalion of the 18th Brigade and a squadron of 8 M3 General Stuart tanks had landed at Oro Bay under the overall command of Brigadier George Wotton. They were to take over the sector of Warren Force, with the mission of clearing the Dorapa Plantation, New Strip and Old Strip areas. As we've seen, the intrusion of tanks into this front was something that had been largely sought by the American command, and now the ex-squadron of Captain Norman Whitehead, which consisted of highly trained crews of the 2nd 6th Armoured Regiment, was about to make its presence felt at Buna. With the 2nd 10th Battalion getting ready to arrive by December 18th, and with the 3 American battalions of Warren Force assigned to his command, Wotton planned to launch a first assault with the experienced 2nd 9th Battalion, hoping to capture Cape Ndiaidere to establish a line running from the east end of New Strip to the west end of Old Strip. This attack would be supported by 7 of Whitehead's tanks, aircraft, artillery and American mortars. Though the weather ended up preventing aircraft from assisting the attack, the artillery commenced its bombardment at 0650 on December 18th, and the Australians finally launched their fierce assault 10 minutes later. The tanks spearheaded the advance into the Japanese strongpoints, with the 3 companies of the 2nd 9th Battalion moving close behind them. Despite the tenacious defense of the surprised Japanese from their well-concealed bunkers, Whitehead's tanks rapidly started to batter post after post, the infantry closing in behind them to hurl their grenades through the small openings to finish off the fanatic defenders. Although the push through the Duropa plantation proved more difficult than the attack up the coast, by the end of the day, Wotton's men would successfully advance to a line 400 yards west of Cape Ndiadere that ran from the east of New Strip to the sea. Yet the fierce Japanese also inflicted considerable losses on them, destroying 2 tanks and badly wounding both Whitehead and Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hodgson, the commander of the 2nd 6th Armoured Regiment. The following day, the Australians would clean up the area they had taken as they adjusted their line, while at the same time, the American forces would mop up the captured territory and would also move west to support the attack against the New Strip. Meanwhile, with his defensive line completely broken, Colonel Yamamoto had to order the 229th Regiment's men to execute a fighting withdrawal back to the government station, with the soldiers immediately pulling back to bunkers near the Samemi Bridge and the foul swamp into which the creek merged. On December 20th, Wotton's attack would at last resume, with the objective of securing the mouth of the Samemi Creek. Supported by a strong air bombardment and reinforced with 1 company of the 2nd 10th, the Australians would again overrun a large amount of Japanese positions, successfully pushing west towards Strip Point. Past this point, however, the attackers would have to push across 2 clearly marked patches of kunai, a treacherous terrain that proved to be too much for the tanks. 2 of them were bogged so deep that they were held fast, and only the beach now offered any chance of getting the tanks forward. Thus, the Australians would have to continue without their valuable tank support, suffering many more losses against the enemy mortars and snipers. By nightfall, the Japanese had withdrawn across the Samemi Creek to establish new defensive positions at its crossing points. The Australians had established a perimeter halfway between Strip Point and the creek, and the Americans had occupied the New Strip area to join their comrades against the enemy line. In the meantime, General Eichelberger was finally planning to launch his attack on the government station by securing a foothold on the government gardens. On the night of December 21st, a company of the 3rd Battalion 127th Regiment thus crossed Entrance Creek amidst heavy yet inaccurate fire by the alert defenders, and then secured a landing to cover the passage of a 2nd Company the following day. Immediately, American engineers set out to construct a bridgehead through which 3 more companies of the 127th Regiment would move forward on December 24th. At the same time, taking advantage of how stretched thin the enemy SNLF Marines were while fighting at the 2 fronts, a strong patrol of the 3rd Battalion had crossed into Masita on the afternoon of December 22nd, traversing the island from west to east largely unopposed and successfully securing the government station bridge by December 23rd. Now, the Americans were finally ready to launch their renewed offensive. But first, we have to return to Brigadier Wotton's front. Unable to cross the Samemi Creek against the fortified enemy positions, on December 21st, Wotton ordered Warren Force and the 2nd 10th Battalion to search the creek for alternative crossing places. With strong determination, the Australians quickly discovered that it might be possible to cross the creek where it twisted itself into a U-bend, a short distance northeast of the lower end of Old Strip. A company was sent to check this avenue, and to their surprise, they would successfully cross the creek and find themselves in the Old Strip after establishing the bridgehead. By December 23rd, as the 2nd 9th Battalion completed the capture of the eastern bank of the creek at a high cost, the 2nd 10th had crossed into the Old Strip and was ready to face the enemy on the bridge. The Japanese there actually considered the swamps and the creek in their rear to be impassable, so they were completely surprised when the Australian forces fell upon them, forcing them to finally abandon the sites which had defied the Americans for so long. By the end of the day, Warren Force had at last crossed the bridge, and the 2nd 10th had made tremendous progress along the Old Strip. Supported by 4 tanks, the Allied forces then continued their advance along the Old Strip on December 24th, and although the last tanks at Wotton's disposal would be rapidly destroyed by a concealed anti-aircraft gun, the Australian shock troopers fiercely broke through the Japanese defences, successfully advancing about 700 yards on the right flank as the Americans mopped up the ground behind them. With the eastern sector's defences completely broken, the Japanese now had to carry out a fighting rearguard to disguise Yamamoto's withdrawal to Garopa Plantation. This rearguard was ordered to fight to the bitter end, and as they desperately tossed grenades out of their foxholes at the advancing Allied forces, they would successfully delay the attackers and inflict many casualties on them. Thus, for the next few days, Wotton's forces would slowly attempt a costly infiltration to overrun the remaining Japanese fortifications, consolidating their position on the Old Strip by December 27th as the defenders began to yield against the tenacity of the attackers. Without tank support, the Allied soldiers would also suffer many casualties, but they would then be luckily reinforced by more artillery and 12 new tanks. On December 28th, a new attack would be launched, with each flank trying to squeeze the Japanese against Garopa Creek. But after a day of bloody skirmishes and local forays, not much progress would be made. Even worse, during the night, the desperate defenders launched a series of surprise counterattacks and raids against the attackers, inflicting even more casualties on the Allied forces. The following day, Wotton planned to launch another attack, this time supported by 4 of the newly arrived tanks. Yet the tanks would advance too quickly ahead of the infantry, rapidly overrunning an abandoned line of bunkers and immediately continuing on to the second line. While the tanks moved forward, the Japanese filtered back to the front bunkers in time to subject the advancing troops to intense fire when they arrived, inflicting heavy casualties on them and forcing the Allies to stop their attack. In any case, the success of that resistance would be short-lived. Now, however, we need to return to the Urbana front. On December 24th, Eichelberger and Colonel Groves finally ordered the 3 companies of the 3rd Battalion to commence its advance, yet the tall and coarse kunai that concealed the enemy bunkers made their movement sluggish, and the viciously effective fire from hidden positions distorted the strength and purpose of the American companies. By the end of the day, the attackers had suffered many casualties, with only some small progress achieved on the right and centre to show for it. On Christmas Day, as the 1st Battalion 127th Regiment began to arrive at the front, Groves attempted another assault with all his companies, but yet again it would face the same stiff resistance. This time, however, 2 companies on the left would manage to establish a perimeter about 300 yards from the sea and 600 yards below the government station. Yet the Japanese rapidly recovered from their surprise, and with great ferocity, they encircled and isolated the American companies. In the next couple of days, Groves would repeatedly attempt to drive a corridor through from the left front to the beleaguered men, but the tenacious SNLF Marines would stop them each time. Finally, on the morning of December 27th, as one company spent the day drilling into the Japanese swamp positions on the left, another company began to edge closer and closer to the American pocket until it finally got through in the afternoon. Once this was achieved, Captain Yasuda realized at last that the triangle was being completely outflanked, so he decided to order its evacuation. At this point, however, reports abounded that the American soldiers were suffering from battle shock and had become incapable of advance. But on December 28th, the American forces unexpectedly consolidated their corridor to the forward positions, and much progress would thus be achieved on the right and centre. Although the Japanese were continuously mounting counterattacks with hand-to-hand combat, such as on Mesita Island, where they repelled an American attack, Yasuda's assessment was that they couldn't hold the garrison beyond the next morning. During the night, the attackers would also cautiously enter into the triangle, finding only empty bunkers and trenches strewn with abandoned arms and ammunition. As the approach through Mesita and the government gardens seemed too heavily contested, General Eichelberger began to seek an alternative approach to finally launch his assault on the government station. Luckily for him, on the night of December 29th, a patrol found that the Japanese were no longer contesting the passage between Buna village and the government station, so he immediately planned to attack through there and through Masita Island with the 2nd Battalion 127th Regiment, while the 1st Battalion exerted more pressure from the gardens. By December 30th, Yasuda's forces numbered only 250 men, and food was scarce, so even though General Yamagata was planning to send the 170th Regiment to rescue them, Yasuda believed that they would only be able to hold out for a short time longer. The following day, the final offensive started as 2 companies crossed from Masita, trying to draw to themselves the main enemy attention. Yet irresponsible firing alerted the Japanese before the bridgehead had been established, and the companies started to suffer heavy damage. Only the timely intervention of Colonel Groves to rally the troops would manage to avert a disaster, and the beachhead would at last be secured. Yet the Japanese, great defensive fighters as they'd proved themselves at every point along the coast, still staved off the inevitable, grudgingly yielding only a little to the pressure from the south and west. In the meantime, Brigadier Wootton at last saw his exhausted forces get relieved by the fresh 2nd 12th Battalion, managing to conduct a renewed offensive on January 1st, 1943, with 6 tanks supporting. The tanks would then quickly cut through Goropa Plantation, immediately starting to clear the beach down to the Samemi mouth, with infantry mopping up behind, albeit at a high cost in men. That same day, Eichelberger also renewed his offensive, and although the tenacious defenders continued to resist, the garrison was reaching a breaking point and starting to disintegrate. By nightfall, with the situation untenable, a general withdrawal had been decided. Swimmers would thus be seen by the Americans attempting to escape, but most of them would be cut down by the Allied fire. By mid-afternoon on January 2nd, Wootton's tanks would meet Groves's men west of Goropa Point, and 2 companies of the 127th Regiment would finally break through the bridge and capture the government station. From their bunker, both Yasuda and Yamamoto defied their orders to escape, instead choosing to meet their deaths in battle. Amidst the pandemonium, both commanders and their fierce men, who had held an overwhelming force for such a long time, would be finally annihilated. 2 days later, Colonel Yazawa would lead 250 men to advance on Tarakena, driving the small American force there away and using it as a point to pick up the few survivors that managed to escape the destruction at Buna. During this struggle, the Japanese are known to have lost a minimum of 1,390 men killed at Buna, and against them, the 18th Brigade lost 863 men since being committed on December 18th, and the 32nd Division suffered a total of 1,957 casualties. Thus came to an end the Buna front. Now only Sanananda remained. As we last saw on the Sanananda front, by mid-December, the American forces of the 126th Regiment had successfully established the Huggins roadblock, subsequently defending their gained perimeter as the Australian 30th Brigade drained out its strength trying to relieve Lieutenant Del Ponte's exhausted men. Assessing the situation, Generals Herring and Vassie knew that they needed to reinforce their depleted forces on this front. With the 18th Brigade assigned to reinforce Warren Force, the Australians knew that they couldn't leave Milne Bay undefended, so the 17th Brigade was out of the question. Only 2 units thus remained in Port Moresby, the Militia 36th Battalion and the 2nd 7th Cavalry Regiment, which had undertaken training as infantry in the last months. By December 15th, as these 2 fresh units began to assemble at Saputa, Brigadier Porter counted with 527 men from his 30th Brigade, 119 soldiers from the 2nd 3rd Battalion, and 555 Americans from the 126th Regiment. The last 2, because of sickness, exhaustion, and reluctance to attack, could only be used in a positional role. In that regard, a policy of patrolling and infiltrating the entrenched Japanese positions had been adopted instead of launching another costly frontal assault. But if the state of the Allied forces was dire, especially that of Huggins's force, it was nothing compared with that of the Japanese they had cut off. Colonel Tsukamoto's men had been in their positions since November 21st without reinforcements or reliable supplies. They were short of food, weapons, and ammunition, dependent on a trickle that came down the Kokoda Track from time to time. Under continual rain by night and scorching sun by day, They were again close to starvation and were ravaged by malaria and diarrhea in a breeding ground created by their own encirclement. Against this background, Vasily planned to renew his offensive by December 19th with his newly arrived cavalry and the remnants of the 30th Brigade. Skirting the most forward Japanese positions and starting from Huggins's roadblock, the 2nd 7th Cavalry was to quickly push along the track and seize the beach area, while Porter's men were to eliminate all the Japanese then remaining in the area from Garua to Garara. On December 16th, the 1st Squadron of the 2nd 7th Cavalry set out along the pathway which came in from the west to cut the Killerton Track, and then passed on to join the Sanananda Track at Huggins's roadblock. This was the same pathway that had been used to supply the roadblock, and although they had to fight their way through a dangerous kunai area in the vicinity of the Killerton Track, the regiment would safely arrive at the roadblock by December 18th, after crossing several swamps, some chest deep, and after passing through the rotting casualties of previous encounters. In the morning of December 19th, Porter's renewed offensive then began as mortar and artillery fire started to fall on the Japanese positions. A few minutes later, his 2 battalions began their closing movement towards the Sanananda Track. Although the 49th Battalion made considerable progress on the right and successfully overran 2 or 3 enemy machine gun positions, the 55th 53rd came against a strongly held area from which 2 machine guns and stubborn riflemen refused to be dislodged. Suffering huge casualties, the composite battalion would fail to overcome the enemy in front, and in the confusion, the attack would have to be called off. Yet the 49th still continued forward, reinforced by a company of the 36th Battalion, and finally got to contact Huggins's roadblock. In the meantime, the 2nd 7th Cavalry had set out along the track with the objective of reaching Sanananda Point at all costs. Dazed after the long night and the savage bombardment, the Japanese allowed the Australian squadrons to advance for about 450 yards without hindrance, until the cavalrymen found themselves facing Colonel Yokoyama's main positions in the central sector. Now thoroughly alert, such a strong and devastating rain of fire fell upon the Australians that the 1st Squadron of the 2nd 7th Cavalry was almost completely annihilated. Instead of launching another frontal assault against these positions, the B Squadron of Captain John James was directed to make a left-flanking sweep, while D Squadron executed the same maneuver to the right. Yet the Marese unit offered strong resistance against this outflanking attempt, so James would only be able to establish a defensive perimeter some 400 yards forward of the Huggins's roadblock. This new tenuous position, with men from the Marese unit still occupying the track between it and Huggins's roadblock, was manned by some 100 men and would be known as the Kano roadblock. Despite the relative success of Captain James, the remaining squadrons of the 2nd 7th Cavalry would have to retreat by nightfall, thus concluding the attack. The following day, Porter ordered the rest of the 36th to join the 49th Battalion in their offensive, yet the inexperienced militiamen would fail to make much progress during the night, suffering many losses against Tsukamoto's forces. Meanwhile, James had been settling his men more firmly within their defences and laying out ground strips to guide the aircraft, which he hoped might bring him ammunition, batteries for his wireless, and food. Vigorous patrolling from both Huggins's and James's roadblocks in the next few days also added much to the Australians' knowledge of the Japanese dispositions. On December 22nd, the Australians thankfully saw some reinforcements arrive, as Brigadier Doherty came over from the Gona area with his 39th Battalion to take command of the Huggins's roadblock area and forward, including the positions held by the 49th Battalion and the 2nd 7th Cavalry. Upon arriving at Huggins, the 39th relieved the battered and exhausted Americans there, yet the men of the 39th were also weary, so Doherty was not to launch any offensive operations. Instead, his mission was to maintain the 2 roadblocks, build up reserves of ammunition and rations, and patrol aggressively. Early on December 23rd, however, D Squadron again departed Huggins's roadblock to establish a line of communication with the Kano roadblock. Swinging wide to the right and moving slowly to avoid detection, the Australians would successfully arrive at James's position by December 24th. and would also establish 2 firm bases across the way for patrols to keep sweeping the line which was being opened. Due to this success, it was determined that the entire 2nd 7th Cavalry Regiment would move to the Kano roadblock, immediately starting to improve and fortify this tenuous position. Meanwhile, Porter saw himself in a similar situation to that of Doherty, so he could achieve little more than active patrolling during what remained of the year. Generals Vassie and Herring agreed that further major offensive action on this front was impossible without tanks and fresh infantry, and these had all been deployed on the Buna front. The well-trained American 163rd Regiment was also earmarked to reinforce the Sanananda front, but it would take some time for their arrival. Thus, the Australians could only wait for now. During this time though, the starving Japanese would become much more aggressive, launching raiding and scavenging parties to get food and ammunition. The most important engagement of this sort happened on the night of December 28th, when a raiding party fell upon the gun positions, exploded a charge in the barrel of one gun and destroyed it. Hence the forward gunners could never feel safe. With the fall of Buna on January 2nd, 1943, however, the forces on this front were finally freed to reinforce Sanananda. Herring then decided that he would form 2 main forces against Sanananda: Vassie's 7th Division, with the 14th, 18th and 30th Brigades, the tanks of the 2nd 6th Armoured Regiment, and the American 163rd Regiment, which arrived on the night of January 2nd, and General Eichelberger's Buna Force, with the 3 regiments of the 32nd Division. The task of the 7th Division would be to capture the Sanananda Point Cape Killerton position and contain the Japanese in the Amboga River-Mambari River area, while Buna Force was to defend the Cape Ndiaye-Buna area from seaborne attack and advance up the coast against the Sanananda defences by way of Tarakena. Yet we'll also recall that Tarakena had fallen to the forces of Colonel Yazawa on January 4th, so Colonel Groves immediately decided to send the 3 companies of the 127th Regiment to retake this vital position. These would cross Siwari Creek the following day, slowly approaching their objective while the Japanese executed delaying actions. By nightfall on January 8th, the 127th had reached Tarakena, holding their enemies at bay at the village. 2 fresh companies then came through these tired men and finally reduced the village before the night was far advanced. Yet strong Japanese positions would then successfully stop the American advance at Konombi Creek until January 10th, when a bridgehead was at last established. But this well-earned success quickly turned sour, as they discovered that the terrain ahead was impassable, with the ocean and swamps merging at high tide, so it seemed the American advance would have to be paused for the time being. Meanwhile, Vassie had deployed the 163rd Regiment of Colonel Jens Doe in the positions in and around the 2 roadblocks, preparing the Americans to launch a renewed offensive to reduce Colonel Tsukamoto's forces on the southwest sector. To support them, the 18th Brigade would also relieve the depleted 30th Brigade and 126th Regiment, with the 2nd 7th Cavalry becoming a part of Brigadier Wooten's forces. On December 8th, action finally resumed as Colonel Doe proposed to overcome the main Japanese positions between the 2 roadblocks. After a heavy bombardment of the 2 defensive perimeters of the Marese unit, the 1st Battalion 163rd Regiment launched its assault, but was easily repulsed by the battle-hardened defenders. The next day, after this failure, it was the turn of the 2nd Battalion, under the command of Major Walter Rankin, which was to strike across country towards the Killerton Track as per Vassie's main plan. Rankin's advance would be swift and face little opposition, so by the end of the day, his battalion was sighted across the track in close contact with the enemy positions to the south, in a position that was to be known as the Rankin Roadblock. It's been almost 9 weeks since the start of the Battle of Buna-Gona, a battle of swamps, high kunai grass and flooded creeks, a battle between desperate men. On one side, the defenders, once victorious invaders, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, were now forced to take refuge in bunkers which they couldn't exit, living among their own dead and waste, and falling victim to hunger and tropical diseases. On the other, The attackers, who felt for the first time in the war they held the upper hand, boldly took a step forward to defeat that enemy which looked so superior in the last year, yet saw instead many of their comrades and allies get killed by bullets coming out of nowhere, shot by men on the verge of collapse. The battle was bloody, and both sides lost much during these 9 weeks. But the outcome would show that the tide had turned, and that 1943 would be vastly different than 1942. Victory at a high cost, defeat at a higher cost. At this point, Generals Oda and Yamagata had taken over command of the Garua-Sanananda front, finding there that although the Japanese forces were defending grimly and efficiently, giving ground only after inflicting heavy losses, their physical condition was declining drastically because of the heavy Allied bombardment, the tropical illnesses, and the devastating starvation. Furthermore, morale was low and discipline was breaking, with many Japanese soldiers criticizing and disobeying their officers, although this didn't materialize into any sort of mutiny or desertion. The lack of food was also so bad that many soldiers, especially in Colonel Tsukamoto's command, would have to resort again to cannibalism. Unaware of the state of the enemy, General Vassi had pressed on with a 4-stage attack for January 12th, with the first phase already carried out, as the 2nd Battalion, 163rd Regiment successfully cut the Kokoda Track and established the Rankin roadblock. By January 10th, Brigadier Wooten's 18th Brigade had also arrived on the battlefield, closely cupping the Japanese positions astride the main road and initially testing the enemy defences with patrols. Wooten's plan of attack was to have the 2nd 9th and 2nd 12th Battalions clear the junction between the Kokoda and Sanananda tracks in separate phases. For the first phase, he only envisaged a closure towards the junction via the simultaneous attack of his 2 battalions, each reinforced by a company of the 2nd 10th, and supported by 3 M3 tanks on the left. On the morning of January 12th, the Australian attack started under the cover of mist. Although the 2nd 9th rapidly advanced through the swampy bush to circle the right flank and get to a position roughly northwest of the road junction, the 2nd 12th wouldn't fare that well. As the arrowhead of Vassi's attack, the tanks stepped forward and quickly found that the track was mined, and the Japanese still had anti-tank shells at their disposal for such an emergency. Since Colonel Tsukamoto had fired his anti-tank guns for the last time on December 23rd, the Allies had been led to believe that the enemy had run out of ammunition, and this mistake would cost them all their tanks. Worthy of mention is the crucial role played by the Nakukahan Suicide Squad, which jumped on the stricken tanks, opened their turrets, and dropped in hand grenades and Molotov cocktails, finally perishing in the explosion along with the tanks. Thus, without tank support, the attack of the 2nd 12th would be easily repelled, scarcely advancing at all by the end of the day. Disappointed, Vassi conferred with Wooten and Eichelberger and finally determined that another frontal assault was too costly, instead deciding to cut the Japanese supply lines and harass them with repeated mortar bombardment. Unbeknownst to him, however, Colonel Tsukamoto, who at this point was operating autonomously because his lines of communication to General Oda had been completely cut off, had also taken a drastic determination. With his starving and exhausted forces reduced to 240 men, including sick and wounded, Tsukamoto had decided to evacuate the southwest sector on the night of January 12th. The sick and wounded were left to hold their positions to the last, while those that were fit attempted to stealthily break through 2 lines of Allied troops and escape out of that hellhole. Many of those who were left behind valiantly volunteered to resist the enemy to their last breath to give their comrades enough time to escape, grenade in hand to kill themselves as well as their enemy. Led by Tsukamoto, the remnants of the once proud South Seas Detachment left their wounded behind and silently escaped towards the Kamusi River by January 15th. Yet this was only the beginning of their ordeal, as their way through the swamps and jungles to the mouth of the Kamusi was rough and unforgiving. Miraculously, 120 totally exhausted men managed to reach Barambari on January 23rd, and then boarded small boats to start the journey up the coast to Leh. Meanwhile, the Australians had discovered the enemy withdrawal on January 14th, immediately sweeping into the area and capturing the entire road junction by nightfall. Vassie then ordered Wootton's 18th Brigade to pursue the retreating enemy, pushing down the Killerton Track to the coast and seizing the Cape Killerton area, while Doe's 163rd Regiment was to destroy the Japanese in front of the roadblocks, and then advance directly along the Sanananda Track. Finally, the 14th Brigade had been deployed in the Gona area to cut off any Japanese moving westward. While this was happening, we'll recall that a decision had been reached to evacuate Guadalcanal and possibly the Sanananda-Garua area. By January 13th, this plan had been formalized by Generals Imamura and Yamagata, sending the 102nd Regiment to reinforce Leh and ordering General Yamagata to withdraw towards the mouths of the Kamusi and Mambare rivers on January 25th, when there would be moonlight to assist. From there, they would board small boats up the coast to Leh, just like Tsukamoto did. On the morning of January 15th, Wootton's advance along the track began, with the 2nd 10th Battalion leading. The Australians moved fast until they petered out among the bushes and swamps. There, the march would be harsh and slow, as sometimes the water was over their heads and most times up to their armpits. They also marched in confusion, as they didn't know the location of Killerton village among the forbidding marshes. By January 16th, however, the 2nd 10th had reached the beach, and after sending its companies in separate ways, then captured Y Point and Killerton village by nightfall. Further south, the 2nd 12th departed the Coconut Grove on the Killerton Track and struck east towards the Sanananda Track, aggressively firing at the Japanese positions as they passed them, and reaching the track by January 17th. Finally, the 2nd 9th Battalion was sent east through Killerton village to bypass the coastal defences, with the mission of directly striking at Sanananda Point. Meanwhile, in the central sector, the Koiwai Battalion and the Marase unit continued to resist the attacks of the Americans. After making little progress on January 15th, Colonel Doe directed his 3rd Battalion to clear out the area between the two roadblocks, ordered the 2nd Battalion to move to the Coconut Grove, and then thrust southeast to cut the Sanananda Track, and sent his 1st Battalion on a drive up west of the road to cut off the enemy lines of communication. By January 16th, the pocket between the Huggins and Kano roadblocks was successfully cleared, and 3 companies would similarly cut off the track north of the Kauai Battalion to completely surround them. They would continue to attack the Japanese central sector in the next few days, but with no success, something that earned Vassie's criticism that the Americans lacked an offensive spirit. In the meantime, the 127th Regiment also resumed its advance towards Garua on January 16th, after crossing the Kanombe Creek. The Americans initially faced strong resistance by well-sighted weapons, which commanded the narrow approaches. But as the days passed, they started to make more progress and face less resistance. By January 19th, the main enemy line had been virtually broken with the aid of a mountain gun, so they would then easily continue their advance unopposed. On January 17th, the Australians at Y Point also attempted to continue their advance towards Sanananda, yet were abruptly checked after 200 or 300 yards by strong positions manned by Japanese cavalrymen. For the next couple of days, they would be unable to advance, mainly focusing on reducing the enemy defences with their mortars. At the rear of the central sector, the 2nd 12th was at the same time advancing up the track, but also found strong resistance from Colonel Yazawa's 41st Regiment, which forced them to slow down their advance. Japanese casualties were high at this point, with the encirclement cutting off their main escape routes. Although those in the main strongholds resisted fiercely, their prospects were grim, and the Japanese command structure was also starting to fall apart. On one occasion, Colonel Yokoyama, now back in command of the 15th Independent Engineers, had to assemble the sick and wounded at the beach for their evacuation, yet the narrow strip of beach was heavily subjected to constant shelling. As night fell on January 17th, 2 barges silently approached the beach to carry General Yamagata and the Buna detachment staff to Barumbari. But as communications had been cut off, the barges got commandeered by Yokoyama to evacuate the sick and wounded instead, something that provoked the ire of the Japanese general. Nonetheless, Yamagata still had 6 barges at his disposal, and realizing the situation was unsalvageable, he finally decided that he couldn't wait until January 25th. he instead planned to start the evacuation on January 20th, with his barges taking designated units by sea and with the 170th Regiment having the mission to break through towards Gona and up the coast to Barumbari. On January 18th, after a heavy rain during the night, the 2nd Ninth was finally approaching Sanananda Point through an unlikely approach that was not strongly defended. Ploughing through mud and water up to their waists, the Australians rapidly crushed 2 enemy strongpoints and captured Sanananda village, then clearing Sanananda Point and establishing 1 company at the mouth of the Garua River by nightfall. The following day, another company was sent south to aid the 2nd 12th Battalion in its advance. By January 19th, the 2nd 12th was still facing strong resistance along the track, so it was decided to send 1 company in an enveloping maneuver to the left, resulting in the capture of the western side of the track. Yet despite this, the surrounded Japanese would continue to resist the subsequent attacks over the next few days, finally retreating by January 21st. On the night of January 19th, however, the Japanese evacuation started at last, with 2 barges bringing Yamagata, his staff, and selected units to Barumburi, though 140 men, including Colonel Yazawa, would die during the journey. 4 more barges would return the following evening to withdraw more forces on the coast, while at the same time, the 170th Regiment spearheaded the withdrawal through enemy lines, though they decided to fight their way instead of stealthily retreating like Tsukamoto had done. Therefore, the 170th's men came under heavy attack trying to break through, and the majority were killed in repeated encounters, although some of the Japanese forces would be able to escape thanks to their sacrifice. Most of the Japanese retreating on the coast, however, would be overtaken by Allied pursuers. After finding out about Yamagata's escape, General Oda remained to oversee the withdrawal of the last units. Feeling like he'd been betrayed by his superior, who didn't stay to cover the evacuation, as was military tradition, Oda would end up committing suicide before he could be captured by the Allies. In the central sector, meanwhile, the trapped forces also received their orders to retreat, and although they initially considered this impossible, the Koiwai Battalion would lead a breakthrough on the Allied perimeter under the cover of torrential rain. By dawn, the withdrawal had moved past the Allied front lines, and by noon it reached what they thought would be a well-patrolled track to Basabua with a line of Allied positions. Once again, the sick and wounded would be left to protect the withdrawal, in an act of sacrifice that was considered sacred by the invaders. Though the 14th Brigade had been very much on the alert during these days, they simply couldn't detect every enemy soldier escaping stealthily through the bushes, and so Koiwai would be able to slip through by January 28th, just like Tsukamoto had done. Yet the Allies were not sitting idly by either. On January 20th, the 2nd 10th finally managed to break through from Y Point, advancing about 500 yards before they met another strong enemy line. And the following day, the 127th Regiment walked virtually unopposed into Garua, finding a scene of death and desolation in the main Japanese base. The 2nd 9th and 2nd 12th were also trying to annihilate the remaining forces on the coast, and on January 22nd, the central sector would be finally cleared by Doe's 163rd Regiment. The 2nd 10th Battalion, aided by the 2nd 9th, would similarly clear all remaining opposition on the coast, finally bringing the bloody Battle of Buna-Gona to an end. In Sanananda alone during this last phase, the Allies had lost around 2,100 men, finding almost 1,600 Japanese bodies on the track, which can be counted as their death toll. The battle in itself had left more than 14,000 Australian and American soldiers killed, injured or sick, while the Japanese registered 7,000 killed and around 1,200 wounded or sick that managed to escape. This had been a great victory for the Allies, necessary for MacArthur to show that the Allied offensive had started, but as we can see, at a great cost. Looking at the Pacific today, we see a vast difference between the current situation and that which we're accustomed to seeing in the last year, with the roles of the Japanese and the Allies being completely reversed by now. To the surprise of everyone in Tokyo, the last couple of months had seen a long string of defeats by the Japanese forces in the South Pacific. Just last week, the evacuation of Guadalcanal had been successfully completed, with the rescue of all units on the island under the noses of an American enemy that enjoyed ground, naval and aerial superiority. Yet the Guadalcanal campaign had ended in a complete and decisive defeat, with the Empire of Japan draining their resources to the limit just to end up with an elaborate withdrawal operation. The loss of the Buna-Gona area and the defeat at the Kokoda Track had also been a great shock for Japanese commanders in Tokyo, as their position in New Guinea had much more strategic significance than a small island in the Solomons. Thus, the major reverses suffered at Guadalcanal and Buna-Gona provoked a huge change in the Japanese strategic thinking for the South Pacific region at the beginning of 1943. Complementing Operation KE, the evacuation of Guadalcanal, General Imamura had decided to strongly reinforce the Japanese presence in New Guinea, envisioning to establish 2 new future landing points, with the 2nd Special Naval Base Unit and a battalion of the 21st Regiment being earmarked to land on Wewak, while the other 2 battalions of the 21st Regiment were to land at Madang and secure a new airfield construction site. Additionally, a road construction unit was sent to occupy Tuluvu in Cape Gloucester, and a force of SNLF Marines was sent to secure a landing site at Finschhafen. By the start of the new year, these places had been successfully occupied, and the construction of the new airfields had been started. Furthermore, Imamura also planned to bring 2 army divisions to reinforce New Guinea, the 20th and 41st Divisions, as well as extra air units once the new airfields had been constructed. Meanwhile, General Adachi was sending considerable reinforcements to Leh, planning to secure the area with the recently arrived 51st Division. Back on January 5th, a Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul for Leh, carrying the Okabe Detachment, a regimental group of the 51st Division under Major General Okabe Toru, which mainly comprised the 3 battalions of the 102nd Regiment of Colonel Maruoka Kohei and the 2nd Battalion of the 14th Artillery Regiment. Escorted by the 5 destroyers of Captain Kitamura Masayuki, the convoy was spotted by American aircraft near Gasmata at 10:35 on January 6th. An immediate airstrike with 16 P-38s would then be launched, although it would only get to claim 9 enemy planes and only 1 possible bomb hit. During the night, however, an attack by an Australian PBY Catalina would manage to sink one of the transports, successfully killing 456 Japanese soldiers and wounding another 85. As the survivors were picked up by the Maikaze, the convoy then continued on to Leh, though another airstrike would manage to severely damage a transport ship during the final approach. At last, the Japanese convoy reached Leh during the afternoon of January 7th, immediately starting the unloading with haste. Despite the 416 enemy sorties that ended up destroying 2 transports, the majority of the Okabe detachment, almost 4,000 men, would successfully land on New Guinean soil. They would then move down the coast to Salamaua, from where the Okabe detachment planned to launch an assault on the town of Wau. In the meantime, the guerrilla Kanga force of Lieutenant Colonel Norman Flay was not going to sit idly by either. After their successful raids on Salamaua back in late June 1942, the Australians had been ordered to lay low and protect the air installations at Wau, with the secondary task of keeping an eye on the Japanese garrison in the Leh Salamaua area to report on their strength and movements. By late August, however, after reports of Japanese forces approaching Mubo, Flay had decided to scorch the Bololo Valley and withdraw towards Winnema and Kajeru to hold the important Bulldog Track, which held his line of communication with the New Guinea force at Port Moresby. Furthermore, General Blamey was planning to use this track for an overland drive on Leh after the Kokoda Track and the Buna-Gona area could be secured. Thus, Wau would be abandoned, and the Japanese would capture Mubo with force on August 31st. Weeks then passed, however, and the Australians realised that the enemy was not planning to advance any further. During the next few months, Kanga Force would continue to acquire valuable information and to raid the Japanese presence at Mubo. Reinforced with the 2nd 7th Independent Company of Major Thomas McCaddy in late October, Flay would also decide to reoccupy Wau and start a reconstruction program of the Bololo Valley. A major raid on Mubo was also planned for January 11th, with McCaddy leading 180 Australian commandos to seize Vickers Ridge, while Captain Winning and 150 commandos secured Matmat Hill and Observation Hill. From there, under a pouring rain, the Australians launched a series of concerted attacks on Mubo that lasted for 3 days and killed many Japanese soldiers. Then Mikadi withdrew back to the saddle, where 350 soldiers from the recently arrived Okabe detachment launched a strong counterattack on January 16th. As the attack pressed on heavily, the Australians began to fall back in a well-controlled movement, so nightfall would find them settled at House Banana. At the same time, knowing that the Japanese had landed a substantial force on Leh and that they might attack Wau, Blamey decided to send the 17th Brigade of Brigadier Murray Motten to take over the defence of Wau and prepare for an overland offensive against the Leh Salamaua area. Meanwhile, after the January 16th engagement, General Okabe decided to advance on Wau down an old and long disused track, running through difficult country, which was parallel to the Black Cat track. Because of this, the two sides then lost contact, which allowed the Japanese to gain tactical surprise for their attack on Wau. Yet the advance would also be very difficult and take longer than expected, something that left the invaders short on food and that allowed the Australians to bring the bulk of the 2nd 5th and 2nd 6th Battalions by January 27th. As Okabe's men negotiated the climb up to Waipali and then the precipitous descent back down into the Bitoi Gorge, Australian patrols roamed the Wau-Mubo area to find the precise axis of the Japanese thrust towards Wau. By January 26th, however, the track that the Japanese were using had been discovered, so Brigadier Motten decided to send the 2nd 6th Battalion with commandos attached to destroy all the Japanese forces between the Black Cat and House Copper. But before the Australians could commence their offensive, Okabe's forces finally fell on the Australian positions at Wandumi during the early hours of January 28th, positions that were manned by the A Company of Captain Wilfred Sherlock. As the Japanese attacked with ferocity, Sherlock calmly decided to move his company onto a nearby spur to the southwest. Reinforced with a platoon of the 2nd 5th and some commandos, the Australians would tenaciously resist until the late afternoon, employing cool and well-directed Australian fire to break up the enemy attacks. Sherlock himself would lead a bayonet charge to repel Japanese infiltrators and restore some lost positions, allowing his men to hold on through the night, even though his ammunition was running short and the Japanese were ferociously encroaching. Motten would immediately react by sending a recently landed company of the 2nd 5th to reinforce the defenders. They would arrive during the night to help Sherlock withdraw to the Bololo River, where they would attempt to delay the enemy advance long enough for the remaining reinforcements to land on Wau. Meanwhile, Winning's commandos were also sent from Black Cat to reinforce Sherlock, although they would end up retreating to Wau as the sounds of fighting were leading in that direction. Similarly, the bulk of the 2nd 5th would be ordered to move with haste to reinforce Wau's defences. At the Bololo, however, Sherlock would be killed as he attempted to cross the raging river, yet his forces would nevertheless continue to resist before completing their retreat behind the river, successfully delaying the Japanese advance for an entire day and forcing Okabe to divert his forces to the flanks. As such, some Japanese units of the 2nd Battalion would get to cross the river near the Black Cat track. The detachment headquarters would move to capture Kaisenik and its supplies, and the 1st Battalion would get lost in the dark as it advanced south towards Crystal Creek. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion would finally end up near Ballams, so the unit would have to circle back, arriving at Crystal Creek by 0700 on January 29th. Their confusion would allow the 2nd 5th to safely arrive at Wau. With the dawn of January 29th, Okabe had wasted the element of surprise that was gained through the difficult march on the Jap track. But Motten also knew that he needed to be reinforced immediately if he hoped to succeed. Luckily for him, the conclusion of the Battle of Buna-Gona allowed General Blamey to deploy most of his aircraft for the defence of Wau. Thus, the last company of the 2nd 5th Battalion and the bulk of the 2nd 7th would successfully land on Wau by early afternoon. By that time, the vanguard of the Okabe detachment was also reaching the outer defences of the airfield, although the defenders would manage to stop them at Larry's farm. Yet the Australians would have to wait for the next Japanese attack until 0400 on January 30th, as two companies assaulted the slaughter yards and the racecourse. In both places, the Japanese attack would be soundly defeated by the resolute defence of the 2nd 7th's men and Winning's commandos. and by the next morning, 2 25-pounder guns were also landed and immediately employed to shell the enemy, with Australian bowfighters being sent to fire on the Japanese forces as well. The recent attacks also forced Moten to request more reinforcements, so the 2nd 3rd Independent Company of Major George Worf would be flown on January 31st, with a machine gun company also arriving the following day. This left Moten confident enough to claim that the situation at Wau was now well at hand. Similarly, Okabe now knew that he was facing a large enemy force, so he decided to suspend any major assault, with his forces instead engaging the defenders in a series of skirmishes for the next few days. Looking further south, after the collapse of Japanese resistance in the Buna-Gona area, the remnants of the once proud South Seas Detachment and of reinforcements that had arrived to relieve them began a difficult withdrawal towards the Leh Salamaua area. Colonel Tsukamoto, having withdrawn his forces back on January 12th, arrived at Barumbari near the mouth of the Kumusi almost 11 days later. Major Koiwai, who led the retreat of the ragtag soldiers of the central sector, also began to arrive at Barumbari on January 28th. Finally, around 4,000 men, including sick and wounded, had broken out from Garua, although 850 of these would not make it back to Barumbari. The rest arrived individually or in small groups, some barely able to walk, and some still remarkably fit, and then started to be ferried up to Mambare. By February 7th, the entire Buna detachment had assembled at Mambare, where landing vessels, around 20 barges brought down from Leh, were being prepared to carry them north to that town. 2 companies of the Akabe detachment also came from Leh with the barges to carry out clearing operations up the Mambare River and to establish a holding camp by the Ampolo River for units withdrawing overland, where they would actually hold off several attacks by Allied pursuit parties. On February 11th, the Japanese survivors would finally start their last journey towards the Leh Salamaua area, although progress would be agonizingly slow because they could only move safely during the night. By late April, the South Seas Detachment was finally evacuated to Rabaul, where the 18th Army finally dissolved one of the most famous detachments of the Imperial Japanese Army, reabsorbing it into the 55th Division, then fighting at Burma. Returning to Wau, action restarted on February 2nd, as Major Worf was ordered to attack Woody Island in front of the racecourse. Yet the Japanese troops were well dug in behind a steep-banked creek, and so the Australian commandos would suffer many losses and would have to withdraw. After the failure of the attacks on the previous 2 days, however, Worf prepared to launch a major assault on February 4th, as he now knew the layout of the Japanese defense positions and would ensure that support fire was directed to the right places. With artillery, mortar and machine gun fire targeting key enemy positions, the Australians charged with bayonets fixed, with such ferocity that the Japanese had to abandon their positions, withdrawing back to the Bololo River by February 6th. At the same time as the Japanese regrouped at Crystal Creek and prepared for a possible withdrawal, Moten ordered the 2nd 5th and 2nd 7th Battalions to launch a major attack against the enemy and open up a supply route with the forces trapped at Skindawai. Dug in among difficult terrain, however, the Japanese offered determined resistance, only getting pushed a few miles towards Crystal Creek. Finally, February 6th also saw the Japanese launch their first and only major air attack on Wau, which ended in favour of the Allies. The following day, the 2nd 5th continued to attack the main Japanese positions on Crystal Creek, putting much pressure on a force that was already on the brink of starvation. For the next 2 days, the Australians would continue to hammer the enemy defences with infantry assaults and artillery bombardments, gradually pushing back the invaders, although at a high cost. A major breakthrough would finally come on February 9th, as B Company 2nd 5th Battalion managed to push through towards Kaisenik, and then continued on to Skindawai. Meanwhile, many of the Japanese remnants were taking to the hills towards Wandumi, where Akabe had finally determined that his best option was to withdraw back to Mubo before his forces got annihilated. But as the Japanese commenced their final retreat, a surprise was awaiting them on the Jap track. The 2nd 6th Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Wood had effectively cut off the track, successfully harassing the desperate enemy soldiers and inflicting several casualties on the retreating Japanese. Yet the action would end with Wood getting shot in the head and the Australians pulling back. so Okabe's men would finally be able to continue their retreat unopposed. Furthermore, to ensure the orderly withdrawal of the Okabe detachment, the Japanese command at Mubo was sending fresh men into the area to engage the Australian pursuers under Major Wharf and to push back the commandos operating around Waipali. By February 21st, however, Okabe's forces had successfully reached Mubo, signalling the end of the Battle of Wau. During the abortive action to capture Wau, the invaders had lost over 1,000 men, while the Australians suffered around 350 casualties. The actions of Captain Sherlock and his forces had been the decisive point of the battle, as the Japanese advance was delayed long enough for the Australians to rapidly reinforce their defences. This, however, was only the start of a larger and longer campaign to push back the Japanese from Mubo to Salamaua. By the end of the Papua Campaign, the Allies, led by brave and ferocious Australian troops, had scored a major victory, one of their first during the Pacific War. With Port Moresby secured, the immediate threat to the Australian mainland had vanished, and with the virtual destruction of the Japanese forces at Milne Bay and Buna-Gona, the enemy presence in the Papua sector had been entirely cleared, with the Allies successfully building a platform from which to launch a new offensive into the Lae Salamaua area and beyond. In total, without counting the Battle of Wau, the Allies lost during the entire campaign some 2,810 men killed and 17,580 wounded or sick, the majority of them being Australians. In turn, the Japanese lost an estimated 10,195 men killed, 1,526 wounded, and over 250 captured. It is apparent that the invaders lost the majority of their strength in the Papua region, but with a mixture of clever defences and tenacious fighting spirit, they also managed to inflict many more casualties on the Allied forces that outnumbered them, especially at Buna-Gona. Despite their great efforts, they were ultimately defeated. But more fierce fighting was still to come their way, as the Australian and American forces now sought to attack Lae Salamaua and then the Huon Peninsula. More long-form videos and more videos on the Pacific War are on the way, so make sure you have subscribed and press the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.